The life of a retired millionaire crumbles after receiving a devastating call. "Your account has been emptied," said the bank manager, shortly after the final blow. "Dad, we lost the house." João, his guilt-ridden son, confessed. What he decides to do next is shocking. The morning sun cast long shadows through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Harrison Montgomery's study, illuminating the rich mahogany furniture and Persian rugs that had witnessed countless business deals and family gatherings. At 72, Harrison sat in his leather chair, surrounded by the trappings of success that had defined his life for the past 4 decades. The view from his third-floor study overlooked the meticulously maintained gardens of his Newport estate, a testament to the wealth he'd accumulated through years of shrewd investments and calculated risks. His fingers absently traced the edge of his antique desk as he reviewed the quarterly reports from his investment portfolio. These routine checks had become more frequent since his retirement 5 years ago, though he'd always maintained complete confidence in his financial security. The Montgomery fortune was supposed to last generations. That had been his promise to Elizabeth before she left this world. The thought of his late wife brought a familiar ache to his chest. The house felt emptier without her presence, despite his son Michael and grandson Tommy living with him. Michael had given up his promising career as an architectural engineer to help care for Tommy after the divorce, a decision Harrison had supported, knowing the family's wealth would provide for them indefinitely. A gentle knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. "Come in," Harrison called out, expecting to see Mrs. Peterson, his housekeeper of 20 years, with his morning coffee. Instead, his son Michael stood in the doorway, his face unusually pale. Harrison immediately noticed the slight tremor in his son's hands, a detail that sent an unexpected chill down his spine. "Dad, we need to talk," Michael said, his voice barely above a whisper. Before Harrison could respond, the sharp ring of his private line cut through the tension. He held up a finger to Michael, reaching for the phone with practiced ease. "Harrison, Montgomery speaking," he answered, his tone carrying the authority of a man accustomed to commanding respect. The voice on the other end, however, caused his world to tilt on its axis. "Mr. Montgomery, this is James Wheeler from First Atlantic Bank. I'm calling regarding some concerning activities in your accounts." The banker's hesitation spoke volumes. "Sir, I regret to inform you that your primary accounts have been depleted." Harrison's hand tightened around the receiver. "Depleted? That's impossible. There must be some mistake." He could feel Michael's eyes boring into him from across the room. "I wish it were a mistake, sir, but I'm looking at the transactions right now. Multiple high-risk investments, substantial withdrawals, and—" Wheeler paused, clearing his throat. "Sir, there's more. The estate's mortgage has been refinanced without proper authorization." The words hit Harrison like physical blows. His gaze shifted to Michael, who had sunk into one of the leather chairs, his head in his hands. The pieces began falling into place with devastating clarity. "Michael," Harrison's voice carried decades of authority and demanded truth. "What have you done?" His son looked up, tears streaming down his face. "Dad, I'm so sorry. I thought I could fix it. The investment seemed perfect. Guaranteed returns, exclusive opportunities. And Tommy, he got involved with these online games. We didn't realize how much he was spending until—" Harrison held up his hand, silencing his son's rambling explanation. The room seemed to spin as he processed the magnitude of what he was hearing. His entire life's work, the legacy he'd built, the security he'd promised Elizabeth, all of it hanging by a thread. "The house?" Harrison managed to ask, though part of him already knew the answer. Michael's sob confirmed his worst fears. "I tried to leverage it to recover our losses, but the investment fell through, Dad. We're going to lose everything." Outside, the gardeners continued their work, pruning roses and trimming hedges, unaware that the grounds they tended would soon belong to someone else. Harrison stood slowly, walking to the window that overlooked the estate. 4 decades of memories flooded his mind. Elizabeth planting her beloved rose garden, Michael learning to ride his bike on the circular driveway, Tommy taking his first steps on the sprawling lawn. The sound of another phone ringing. Michael's. This time, barely registered in Harrison's consciousness, but his son's next words shattered what remained of his world. "It's the bank's lawyers," Michael whispered, his voice hollow. "The house. It's being put up for auction. And Dad?" He paused, the weight of his next words visible in his expression. "Victor Sterling has already submitted a bid." The name of his longtime rival struck Harrison like a physical blow. Victor Sterling, the man who had tried to destroy his business empire decades ago, who had always envied his success, who had waited years for an opportunity like this. The following weeks unfolded like a nightmare from which Harrison couldn't wake up. Every morning he'd wake in his master suite, hoping it had all been a terrible dream, only to face the harsh reality of their situation. The auction date loomed. Closer, and with each passing day, more friends disappeared from their lives, their phones suddenly going unanswered, their invitations mysteriously lost in the mail. Tommy, his 14-year-old grandson, had become a ghost in the mansion's halls, avoiding eye contact and barely speaking during meals. The weight of guilt crushed his young shoulders. The revelation that his online gaming addiction had contributed to their downfall was almost too much for him to bear. Harrison often heard him crying in his room late at night, but couldn't find the words to comfort him. How do you tell a child that losing millions wasn't entirely his fault? The morning of the auction arrived with cruel brightness, sunlight, streaming through the windows as if mocking their darkness. Harrison stood in his study one last time, touching the furniture that had witnessed so much of his life. Each piece held memories: the desk where he'd signed his first $1 million deal, the chair where Elizabeth used to sit and read, the bookshelf that had supported Tommy's first steps. "Mr. Montgomery." Mrs. Peterson's voice was gentle. "The auction officials are here." Harrison nodded, unable to speak. The housekeeper's eyes were red-rimmed. She'd been with them through everything, and today would be her last day too. The staff had already been notified, severance packages arranged with what little remained of their resources. The auction itself felt surreal. Harrison watched from the sidelines as strangers walked through his home, examining paintings and furniture like vultures circling prey. Victor Sterling moved through the crowds with the confidence of a man who knew he'd already won, his smile growing wider with each passing minute. When the final bid was called, Sterling's victory was complete. He approached Harrison with false sympathy plastered across his face. "Harrison, old friend, how the mighty have fallen. Don't worry, I'll take good care of your precious estate." His words dripped with satisfaction. "Though I might make some changes, that rose garden of Elizabeth's never quite suited my taste." Harrison's fists clenched at his sides, but he refused to give Sterling the satisfaction of a response. Instead, he turned to where Michael and Tommy stood, both looking lost and broken. "Let's go," he said quietly. "There's nothing left for us here." They drove away from the estate in Michael's modest sedan. The luxury cars had already been sold to pay creditors. Their destination was a small rental house in a middle-class neighborhood across town, arranged hastily through one of the few business contacts who hadn't completely abandoned them. The contrast between their past and present couldn't have been starker. The new house, with its peeling paint and overgrown lawn, sat on a narrow lot between similarly worn properties. 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a combined living-dining area, and a kitchen barely big enough for a small table. The furniture inside was basic, purchased from a discount store with their rapidly dwindling funds. Tommy disappeared into the smaller bedroom immediately, the door closing with a quiet click that somehow hurt more than if he'd slammed it. Michael stood in the living room, looking lost among the few boxes of personal belongings they'd been allowed to keep. "Dad," he started, his voice breaking. "I never meant for any of this to happen. The investment seemed so solid. I thought I could double our money, make you proud." Harrison held up his hand, unable to bear more explanations or apologies. "What's done is done," he said, his voice flat. "We need to focus on surviving now." The word surviving hung heavy in the air. For a family that had never worried about money, the concept of budgeting for groceries and utilities was foreign and frightening. Harrison found himself staring at the basic kitchen appliances, realizing he barely knew how to operate them. Mrs. Peterson had always handled such things. That first night in their new home, they ate takeout in silence, sitting on folding chairs around a cheap plastic table. The walls seemed to close in around them, the unfamiliar creaks and sounds of the house a constant reminder of their fall from grace. Through the thin walls, they could hear their neighbors' television, their laughter, their lives continuing normally, while the Montgomerys' world had shattered. Harrison retreated to the main bedroom, a space barely larger than his former closet. As he lay on the unfamiliar mattress staring at the water stains on the ceiling, Elizabeth's voice echoed in his memory. "Money isn't everything, my love. Family is what matters most." He'd agreed with her then, secure in the knowledge that they had both. Now, with only family remaining, he wondered if they would be strong enough to survive this test. The morning light filtered through thin curtains, a stark contrast to the heavy drapes that had once adorned Harrison's bedroom windows. 2 weeks had passed since their move, and each day brought new challenges that tested their adaptability and resolve. The sound of a neighbor's lawnmower rattled through the walls, yet another reminder of how close everything was in this new life. Harrison sat at the kitchen table, struggling with an unfamiliar coffee maker. Mrs. Peterson had always handled such mundane tasks, and now at 72, he found himself learning the basics of household maintenance. His hands, once steady, while signing million-dollar contracts, trembled slightly as he measured coffee grounds. The kitchen door creaked open, and Tommy shuffled in, his school backpack clutched tightly to his chest like a shield. Dark circles under his eyes betrayed another sleepless night. "Morning, Grandpa," he mumbled, avoiding direct eye contact, a habit he'd developed since their downfall. "Good morning, Tommy," Harrison replied, trying to keep his voice gentle despite his frustration with the coffee maker. "Would you like some breakfast? I could—" He paused, realizing he didn't actually know how to prepare anything beyond toast. Tommy shook his head. "Not hungry. I'll grab something at school." He hesitated, then added in a whisper, "If there's enough money for lunch?" The question struck Harrison like a physical blow. To think that his grandson now worried about something as basic as lunch money, it was almost unbearable. "Of course there's enough," he assured quickly, perhaps too quickly. "Don't worry about that." Michael appeared in the doorway, already, dressed in what Harrison recognized as his last remaining business suit, though it hung looser on his frame now. The strain of their situation had taken its toll on his son's appetite as well. "I have 3 job interviews today," Michael announced, attempting to sound optimistic. "One of them is bound to work out." Harrison nodded, knowing better than to mention that this was the 4th set of interviews his son had faced since their move. Each previous attempt had ended the same way. Potential employers couldn't seem to look past the Montgomery family's recent scandal. Victor Sterling's influence in the business community ran deep, and rumors had a way of spreading. "Dad," Michael continued, his voice hesitant, "I was thinking, maybe you could reach out to some of your old contacts. Someone must still be willing to—" "No," Harrison cut him off firmly. "I won't go begging to people who turned their backs on us the moment we fell." Pride was perhaps all they had left, and Harrison clung to it fiercely. The sound of children's laughter drifted through the window, neighborhood kids walking to school. Tommy's shoulders tensed at the sound, and he edged closer to the back door. "I should go. Don't want to be late." "Wait," Harrison called out, noticing a tear in his grandson's backpack. "Your bag—" "It's fine," Tommy interrupted, his voice tight. "The new one you ordered was—" "I cancelled it. We can't afford it right now." Before either adult could respond, he slipped out the back door, leaving a heavy silence in his wake. Michael sank into a kitchen chair, his carefully maintained facade cracking. "He's been selling his video games, you know. Every single one, even the console. I found the receipts in his room." Harrison's throat tightened. The games that had contributed to their downfall, yet watching his grandson sell them off piece by piece, punishing himself, felt worse than the financial loss they'd caused. "He's just a child," Harrison whispered. "He shouldn't have to carry this burden." A knock at the front door startled them both. Through the window, Harrison caught sight of their next-door neighbor, Mrs. Chen, holding what appeared to be a casserole dish. Since their arrival, She'd made several attempts at neighborly friendship, all of which they'd politely deflected. "I'll handle it," Michael said, straightening his tie and moving toward the door. But Harrison held up a hand to stop him. "No, I will. You focus on your interviews." Harrison stood, squaring his shoulders. Having neighbors bring food like they were some charity case stung his pride, but he was beginning to understand that pride alone wouldn't sustain them. Mrs. Chen's smile was warm and genuine as Harrison opened the door. "Good morning, Mr. Montgomery. I made too much breakfast casserole this morning. My children are visiting their grandmother, you see. I thought perhaps your family might enjoy some." The lie was transparent. The casserole had clearly been prepared specifically for them, but there was no pity in her eyes, only kindness. Harrison found himself accepting the dish with murmured thanks, even as his cheeks burned with embarrassment. "You have such a lovely grandson," Mrs. Chen continued, either oblivious to or deliberately ignoring his discomfort. "I see him helping Mrs. Wilson with her groceries sometimes. Such a polite young man." Harrison blinked in surprise. Tommy had never mentioned helping their elderly neighbor across the street. Come to think of it, there were many things about their new life that he realized he didn't know. While he'd been nursing his wounded pride in isolation, had his family been finding ways to adapt that he'd failed to notice? As he closed the door, the aroma of the casserole reminded him of just how long it had been since they'd had a proper home-cooked meal. Michael appeared beside him, drawn by the smell. "Dad," he said softly, "maybe it's time we stopped trying to pretend we're still who we used to be. Maybe," he gestured at the casserole at their modest surroundings, "this is who we are now, and that doesn't have to be a bad thing." The local library became Tommy's sanctuary in the weeks that followed. Harrison discovered this quite by accident, worried about his grandson's frequent absences after school. He'd followed Tommy one afternoon, expecting to find him hiding from bullies or worse, only to find him tucked away in the computer section, surrounded by books on programming and digital design. Today, Harrison watched from between the stacks as Tommy sat at one of the public computers, his face lit by the screen's glow as his fingers flew across the keyboard. The librarian, a kind-faced woman named Ms. Roberts, stopped occasionally to check on him, offering guidance and encouragement. "Your grandson has quite a talent," Ms. Roberts said quietly, noticing Harrison's presence. "He's been working on something fascinating, a project about financial literacy for young gamers. Did you know he's been helping other kids understand predatory gaming practices?" Harrison hadn't known. In fact, he realized with a pang of guilt he'd been so consumed by their losses that he'd failed to notice Tommy's attempts to transform his expensive lesson into something meaningful. "He talks about you all the time," Ms. Roberts continued, "about how you built your business from nothing. He says he wants to do the same thing but differently, helping people avoid the mistakes he made." The words stuck Harrison like an epiphany. While he'd been mourning their lost wealth, his 14-year-old grandson had been trying to create something new from the ashes of their mistakes. That evening, Harrison arrived home to find Michael sitting at their small kitchen table, surrounded by rejected job applications and unopened bills. The contrast between his son's defeated posture and Tommy's determined focus at the library couldn't have been starker. "I saw Tommy at the library today," Harrison began, settling into the chair across from Michael. "Did you know he's been working on a project?" Michael looked up, surprise flickering across his tired features. "He mentioned something about wanting to help other kids, but I thought—" He trailed off, shame coloring his words. "I thought it was just talk, a way to process his guilt." "It's more than that," Harrison said, feeling a spark of excitement he hadn't experienced since their fall from grace. "He's teaching other young people about financial responsibility, using his own experience with those games as a cautionary tale. He's turning our failure into a lesson." Michael's expression shifted from confusion to interest. "You know, before everything happened, I was working on some educational software designs. Nothing came of it, but maybe—" A key turned in the front door and Tommy entered, his worn backpack less hunched on his shoulders than usual. He stopped short at the sight of both his father and grandfather waiting for him. "I can explain," he started, assuming he was in trouble for his library visits. "Ms. Roberts has been helping me with the coding. and I'm not spending any money. I promise. Show us, Harrison interrupted gently. Show us what you've been working on. Tommy's eyes widened, then lit up with cautious hope. He pulled out his notebook, filled with sketches and flowcharts, and began to explain his vision. As he talked, his voice grew stronger, more confident. He described an interactive platform that would teach financial literacy through gaming mechanics, using his own experience to highlight the dangers of impulsive spending and the importance of understanding digital transactions. The kids at school, Tommy explained. Some of them are making the same mistakes I did, but when I tell them my story, show them how these games are designed to make you spend money without thinking, they listen. Ms. Roberts says, if we could turn it into a real program, we could, Michael interjected, his own excitement building. Tommy, some of those programming concepts you're struggling with, I learned them in college. I could help. And Dad. He turned to Harrison. Your business experience, your understanding of financial principles. Harrison held up his hand, but this time not to silence them. Mrs. Chen's son works in tech, he said thoughtfully. She mentioned it when she brought over that casserole. Perhaps, he swallowed his pride, perhaps it's time we started accepting help from our new neighbors, building new connections instead of mourning old ones. The energy in the small kitchen shifted, hope threading through the air like electricity. For the first time since losing everything, they weren't discussing what they'd lost, but what they might build together. There's just one problem, Tommy said hesitantly. We'd need some startup money for proper development tools and... He gestured helplessly at their surroundings. Harrison smiled, reaching for his grandson's notebook. Then it's time I taught you both something about bootstrapping a business. When I started out, I had nothing but an idea and determination. Maybe... He looked around their modest kitchen, at his son and grandson's eager faces. Maybe that's exactly what we need now. The community center's meeting room buzzed with nervous energy as Tommy set up his presentation. Harrison watched from the back, noting how his grandson's hands trembled slightly as he connected his laptop to the projector, a device borrowed from the kind Ms. Roberts at the library. Michael stood nearby, reviewing their notes one last time. This was their first real pitch for the financial literacy project, and their audience consisted of local parents, teachers, and a few small business owners Mrs. Chen had helped them connect with. It wasn't the high-powered boardroom Harrison was accustomed to, but somehow the stakes felt even higher. Ready, champ? Michael asked Tommy softly, squeezing his son's shoulder. The teenager nodded, though his face was pale. 3 months of preparation had led to this moment, countless hours spent in their small living room, refining the concept, writing code, and practicing their presentation. As people filed in, Harrison recognized faces from their neighborhood. Mrs. Wilson, the elderly neighbor Tommy helped with groceries, sat in the front row, her encouraging smile bright. Next to her was Mr. Patel from the corner store, who had recently started letting Michael help with his bookkeeping in exchange for groceries, an arrangement that had helped preserve both their budget and Michael's dignity. Good evening, everyone, Tommy began, his voice barely above a whisper. He cleared his throat and tried again, stronger this time. My name is Tommy Montgomery, and I'm here to talk about something important, how games can trick kids into spending money without realizing it. The room fell silent as Tommy shared his story. He spoke about his own experience with online gaming, how the carefully designed reward systems and peer pressure had led him to spend thousands of dollars of his family's money. But instead of dwelling on the guilt, he channeled it into explanation, breaking down the psychological tactics these games employed. But here's the thing, Tommy continued, growing more confident. We can use these same gaming principles to teach kids about money instead of taking it from them. He clicked to the next slide, revealing the interface he and Michael had designed. Michael stepped forward, taking over the technical portion of the presentation. He explained how their program would use engaging gameplay to teach financial literacy, incorporating real-world scenarios and consequences. Harrison felt a surge of pride watching his son speak with passion about something other than their past wealth. The prototype is basic, Michael admitted, but with proper development resources we could reach children before they fall into the same traps my son did. We could teach them what I failed to teach him." Harrison observed the audience's reactions carefully. He saw heads nodding, parents exchanging knowing looks, teachers taking notes, but he also noticed one particular attendee in the back, Jason Burke, a local tech entrepreneur Mrs. Chen had convinced to attend. Burke's expression was thoughtful, calculating. During the question and answer session, Burke raised his hand. "This is an interesting concept," he began, and Harrison held his breath. "But what makes you think kids will choose an educational game over the flashier alternatives?" Tommy stepped forward before either his father or grandfather could respond. "Because kids don't want to be tricked," he said firmly. "When I explain to my friends how these games manipulated me, they get angry. They want to understand how to manage their money. They just need someone to show them in a way that makes sense to them." Burke's eyebrows rose, impressed by the teenager's conviction. After the presentation, he approached their family. "You need seed money," he stated matter-of-factly, "and more importantly, you need industry connections. I might be able to help with both, but I'd want to see more detailed development plans." Harrison felt his old business instincts kick in, ready to negotiate, but Michael spoke first. "We'd be grateful for any guidance you could offer, Mr. Burke. We know we have a lot to learn." The humility in Michael's voice struck Harrison. Gone was the desperate need to prove himself that had led to their financial disaster. In its place was a genuine desire to create something meaningful, regardless of who got the credit. As they packed up their materials later that evening, Mrs. Chen approached with a group of parents. "We've been talking," she said, "and we'd like to organize a focus group of our kids to test your program. No charge, of course, we just want to help." Tommy's eyes lit up. "Really? That would be amazing. I have so many ideas for features we could test." Harrison watched as his grandson excitedly discussed plans with the parents, his earlier nervousness completely forgotten. The boy who had once hidden in his room, crushed by guilt, was emerging as a confident young man with a purpose. Later that night, in their small kitchen, the three generations of Montgomery men sat around their humble table, the excitement of the evening still buzzing in the air. "You know," Harrison said, breaking the comfortable silence, "this reminds me of my first business presentation. I was terrified, but I believed in what I was selling." "Did it work out?" Tommy asked, curious about this glimpse into his grandfather's past. Harrison smiled. "Not at first. I failed several times before, finding success, but each failure taught me something valuable." He paused, the weight of his words settling in the room. Sometimes losing everything can be the beginning of something even more important. The weeks following their presentation took on a new rhythm. Their small house transformed into a makeshift office, with the kitchen table covered in laptops and notebooks. The focus group Mrs. Chen had organized proved invaluable, providing insights that helped refine their program's interface and features. One Saturday morning, Harrison sat on their modest front porch, sipping coffee from a chipped mug, when a sleek black car pulled up to their curb. His heart skipped a beat when Jason Burke stepped out, carrying a laptop bag and what appeared to be breakfast takeout. "Hope I'm not too early," Burke called out, climbing the worn steps. "I had some thoughts about your project that couldn't wait until Monday's meeting." Harrison moved to invite him inside, but Burke shook his head. "Let's talk out here first. I want to show you something." He opened his laptop, revealing financial projections that made Harrison's eyes widen. "These numbers are conservative estimates of what your program could generate if properly developed and marketed." "Those are significant figures," Harrison said carefully, years of business experience making him cautious about optimistic projections. Burke nodded. "They are, but that's not why I'm here." He closed the laptop and fixed Harrison with a serious look. "I heard about what happened with your estate. More specifically, I heard about Victor Sterling's role in it." Harrison's jaw tightened at the mention of his rival's name. "That's ancient history now." "Is it?" Burke asked. "Because Sterling Industries just announced a new initiative, educational software for children, focusing on financial literacy through gaming." He let that sink in for a moment. "They're trying to steal your grandson's idea, Mr. Montgomery." The news hit Harrison like a physical blow. Before he could respond, Tommy's voice came from the doorway. "Let them try," the teenager said firmly, stepping onto the porch. "Their developers don't understand what kids really need. They haven't lived it like I have." Burke's face broke into a grin. "That's exactly what I was hoping you'd say." He opened his laptop again, this time showing a different screen. "I've been doing some digging. Sterling's company has a history of aggressive acquisitions and idea theft, but they've never gone up against someone with real experience in their target demographic." Inside the house, they could hear Michael moving around the kitchen, probably starting breakfast. "Dad," he called out, "is someone here? I heard voices." "Come out here, son," Harrison responded, his mind racing with possibilities. "Mr. Burke has some interesting news." As Michael joined them, Burke laid out his proposal. He wanted to fast-track the development of Tommy's program, bringing in a team of developers while keeping Tommy as the lead creative consultant. More importantly, he wanted to position their product as the authentic alternative to Sterling's corporate initiative. "The story sells itself," Burke explained excitedly. "A teenager who experienced the problem firsthand, working with his family to create a solution. It's David versus Goliath, and everyone loves an underdog. But we don't have the resources to compete with Sterling," Michael pointed out, the old worry lines creasing his forehead. "You have something better," Burke countered. "You have authenticity, and," he smiled, "you have me. My company is willing to provide the initial funding in exchange for a reasonable partnership stake. You maintain creative control and majority ownership." Harrison studied Burke's expression, looking for any sign of deception. "Why would you take this risk on us?" Burke's smile faded slightly. "Because 15 years ago, Sterling did the same thing to my father's company. He destroyed it, absorbed the assets, and left my family with nothing." He looked at Tommy. "But unlike your grandson, we never found a way to turn that loss into something meaningful." Tommy, who had been quietly listening, spoke up. "Our program isn't just about teaching kids about money anymore, is it? It's about showing them that they can recover from mistakes, that they can create something good even after everything goes wrong." The profound wisdom in his grandson's words made Harrison's throat tight with emotion. He remembered the broken boy who had hidden in his room months ago, crushed by guilt and shame. That boy had transformed into someone stronger, wiser, and more resilient than Harrison could have imagined. Michael placed a hand on his son's shoulder, pride evident in his gesture. "So, what's our next step?" Burke's enthusiasm returned. "First, we formalize our partnership. Then we move fast. Sterling may have more resources, but they're a big company, slow to adapt, tied down by corporate bureaucracy. We can be nimble, responsive to our test group's feedback, and most importantly, genuine in our mission." As they discussed details over the breakfast Burke had brought, Harrison found himself studying his son and grandson. Michael was engaged, offering insights about user interface design from his architectural background. Tommy was practically bouncing with excitement as he described new features they could implement. The future still held uncertainties, but for the first time since losing their fortune, Harrison felt something he'd thought was gone forever: hope. Not just for financial recovery, but for something more valuable, the chance to build something meaningful together as a family. The local coffee shop had become their unofficial meeting spot, a far cry from the executive boardrooms of Harrison's past. Today, the small table was cluttered with tablets and laptops as Tommy demonstrated the latest version of their program to Jason Burke's development team. 2 months had passed since Burke's investment, and their progress had exceeded everyone's expectations. "So when the player makes an impulse purchase," Tommy explained, his fingers dancing across the tablet screen, "the game doesn't just show them losing money, it demonstrates the long-term impact through this interactive timeline." He swiped through various scenarios, each showing how small financial decisions could snowball into significant consequences. Sarah Chen, Mrs. Chen's son, and now their lead developer, nodded approvingly. The psychological impact is subtle but effective. Kids understand consequences better when they can see them play out, Harrison observed from the corner, marveling at how naturally Tommy had stepped into his role as project leader. The shy, guilt-ridden boy was gone, replaced by a confident young man who spoke with authority about user experience and engagement metrics. Michael's phone buzzed on the table, interrupting the presentation. His face darkened as he read the message. "Sterling's development team just released their beta version," he announced, his voice tight. "They're calling it Future Smart Kids." Burke immediately pulled up the application on his laptop, and the group huddled around to examine their competitor's product. The interface was slick, professionally designed, with flashy animations and corporate polish. But as they explored the features, Tommy's expression shifted from concern to determination. "Look at this," he pointed out. "They're using the same manipulative techniques as the games that got me in trouble. Hidden costs, peer pressure mechanics, even subtle gambling elements disguised as investment training." His voice carried a mixture of disgust and validation. "They don't understand the real problem at all." Sarah nodded in agreement. "Their approach is fundamentally flawed. They're treating financial literacy like a game to be won, rather than skills to be learned." "But they have Sterling Industries' marketing machine behind them," Michael worried aloud. "How do we compete with that?" The bell above the coffee shop door chimed, and Harrison's heart stopped as Victor Sterling himself walked in, flanked by two executives in expensive suits. The coffee shop fell silent, other patrons sensing the sudden tension in the air. Sterling's smile was predatory as he approached their table. "Well, well, the Montgomery family's little project. How quaint." His eyes swept over their modest setup dismissively. "Though I must say I'm disappointed you didn't come to me first. Sterling Industries could have provided so much more resources." Tommy stood up straight, meeting Sterling's gaze without flinching. "We're not interested in resources that come with strings attached, Mr. Sterling." Sterling's smile didn't waver, but his eyes hardened. Brave words from someone who nearly bankrupted his family with online games. He turned to Harrison. "You should teach your grandson about knowing his place. Some lessons are better learned early." Harrison felt his fists clench, but before he could respond, Burke stepped forward. "I think you'll find that Tommy knows exactly where he stands, Victor. Unlike your company, he understands what these kids need because he's lived their struggles." "Struggles?" Sterling laughed. "Is that what we're calling poor financial decisions now? Speaking of which, how's the new house, Harrison? I've made some lovely improvements to your old estate. The rose garden is gone, by the way. Put in a tennis court instead." Harrison saw Michael tense beside him, but it was Tommy who spoke up. "You know what, Mr. Sterling? My mom used to say that some people are so busy counting their money that they forget to count their blessings." I think she was right. The simple wisdom in Tommy's words seemed to throw Sterling off balance. He recovered quickly, but Harrison caught the flicker of uncertainty in his rival's eyes. "Well, isn't this touching?" Sterling's voice dripped with sarcasm. "But sentiment doesn't build successful products. Our beta release has already attracted significant attention from educational institutions. How many schools have signed up for your program?" "Quality takes time," Burke interjected smoothly. "We're more interested in getting it right than getting it fast." Sterling's phone buzzed and he checked it with an exaggerated gesture. "Speaking of time, I have a board meeting to attend. In my company's headquarters. You remember what those look like, don't you, Harrison?" He turned to leave, then paused. "Oh, and Tommy, thank you for the market research. Your experience with online gaming was invaluable to our development process." After Sterling and his entourage left, the coffee shop slowly returned to its normal atmosphere. Tommy sat down heavily, his earlier confidence somewhat shaken. "He's trying to use my story against us," he said quietly. Harrison placed a hand on his grandson's shoulder. "No, Tommy. He's trying to use his version of your story, but he doesn't know the whole story, the part about how you turned your mistake into something meaningful, the part about how you're trying to help others avoid the same pitfalls." Sarah was already typing furiously on her laptop. "This is actually perfect," she said, not looking up. Sterling just showed his hand. "Their approach is exactly what we suspected. Corporate, impersonal, and potentially harmful. We can use this." The community center was packed beyond capacity for the Regional Education Technology Conference. Teachers, parents, and education administrators filled every seat, with more standing along the walls. Harrison noticed several Sterling Industries representatives scattered throughout the audience, their corporate badges gleaming under the fluorescent lights. Tommy stood backstage adjusting his tie, a gift from Mrs. Wilson, who had insisted he needed to look professional for his first major presentation. Michael helped him with the final adjustments, their matching navy suits a stark contrast to the Sterling team's expensive designer wear. "Remember," Harrison advised his grandson, "they may have fancy marketing, but you have something they can't buy: authenticity." The presentation began with Sterling Industries' team showcasing their Future Smart Kids program. Their speaker, a polished marketing executive, delivered a slick presentation filled with impressive graphics and ambitious promises. The audience seemed impressed by the professional delivery and corporate backing. Then it was Tommy's turn. He walked to the podium, looking smaller than usual under the bright lights, but his voice was steady as he began. "My name is Tommy Montgomery, and I'm 14 years old. 2 years ago, I lost my family's fortune through online gaming." The room fell silent. This wasn't the polished corporate presentation they had just witnessed. This was raw, real, and immediately engaging. Tommy didn't just demonstrate their program, he shared his journey. He showed how each feature had been born from a painful lesson, refined through countless conversations with other kids who had faced similar challenges. The interface might have been less flashy than Sterling's, but its purpose was clear and meaningful. "We didn't design this program in a boardroom," Tommy explained, gesturing to the simple but effective user interface. "We designed it in my friend Kevin's basement, where he confessed to stealing his mom's credit card for in-game purchases. We refined it at the library, where Jenny told us how she lost her college savings to what she thought was a harmless gaming habit." Michael stepped forward to handle the technical portion, explaining how they had deliberately avoided the manipulative mechanics common in many educational games. "Our goal isn't to make the program addictive," he emphasized. "Our goal is to make it honest." From the audience, a Sterling executive raised his hand. "Your interface lacks the engagement mechanics that modern educational software requires. How do you expect to maintain user interest without proper gamification?" Tommy didn't hesitate. "Would you like to hear what our test group thinks about that?" He gestured to the back of the room, where Mrs. Chen stood with a group of kids from their focus group. One by one, they stood up to share their experiences with the program. "It doesn't try to trick us," one girl said firmly. "It treats us like we're smart enough to understand real financial decisions." A boy Tommy's age added, "I actually showed it to my dad. Now we're using the family budget planning feature together. He says he wishes he had something like this when he was young." The Sterling executive's smug expression faltered as more kids and parents shared their positive experiences. These weren't paid testimonials or carefully scripted marketing messages. They were genuine endorsements from real users. Harrison watched from the wings as Tommy handled the Q&A session with remarkable poise. When asked about competing with Sterling's more established platform, his grandson smiled. "We're not trying to compete with them," he said honestly. "We're trying to help kids like me before they make the mistakes I made. If our program helps just one family avoid what my family went through, then we've succeeded." The applause that followed was thunderous. Education administrators approached them immediately after the presentation, eager to discuss pilot programs in their schools. More importantly, parents sought them out, sharing stories of their own children's struggles with online spending. Later that evening, as they celebrated at their small house with Burke, Sarah, and their other supporters, Harrison overheard Tommy talking to a reporter who had attended the presentation. "Your grandfather was a successful businessman before your family's financial troubles," the reporter noted. "Do you think you'll follow in his footsteps?" Tommy glanced at Harrison before responding. "My grandfather taught me that true success isn't about how much money you make. It's about the difference you make in people's lives. I think I'm just beginning to understand what that means." Harrison felt his eyes growing moist as he listened to his grandson's words. Their old life of luxury and status seemed increasingly distant, replaced by something far more valuable: purpose, integrity, and the chance to make a real difference in the world. Michael joined them, carrying a tablet with the day's analytics. Downloads are already starting to climb, he reported excitedly. But more importantly, look at the user engagement metrics. People aren't just downloading the program, they're actually using it, sharing it, talking about it. Burke raised his coffee mug in a toast. To authentic success, he said, smiling at the Montgomery men, and to proving that sometimes the best revenge is simply doing the right thing. The success of their presentation at the Education Technology Conference created waves that none of them had anticipated. Their modest home's living room had been transformed into a makeshift office, with Sarah and her development team working around the clock to handle the increasing user base. The coffee table was buried under laptops, and whiteboards covered every available wall space. Another school district just signed up for the pilot program, Michael announced, reading from his tablet. The dark circles under his eyes betrayed long nights of coding and troubleshooting, but his voice carried an enthusiasm that Harrison hadn't heard in years. That makes 15 districts in 3 states. Tommy sat cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by feedback forms from their beta testers. The parents' forum is exploding with success stories, he said, holding up one particular message. Listen. To this, my daughter finally understood why I couldn't buy her every game she wanted. Your program helped us have our first real conversation about money. Harrison watched from his usual spot by the window, where he'd set up a small desk to handle the administrative aspects of their growing venture. The view outside was of their modest neighborhood, so different from his former estate, yet somehow it felt more like home than the mansion ever had. A knock at the door interrupted their work. Mrs. Chen entered, carrying her usual basket of homemade snacks, but her expression was troubled. "Have you seen the news?" she asked, setting down the basket and pulling out her phone. The room fell silent as she played a video clip. Victor Sterling stood at a podium, his signature smugness in full display. "While we appreciate the enthusiasm surrounding certain amateur financial education programs," he was saying, "parents should be wary of entrusting their children's financial education to unproven platforms. Sterling Industries has a long-standing reputation for excellence." "Turn it off," Harrison said quietly, but Tommy raised his hand. "No, Grandpa, we need to hear this." His grandson's face was set with determination as Sterling continued his thinly veiled attack on their program. Furthermore, Sterling went on, "We find it concerning that a program created by someone who admitted to reckless spending habits is being considered for implementation in our schools. Sterling Industries' Future Smart Kids program is developed by certified financial experts." Sarah snorted. Certified experts who don't understand how kids actually think about money. She was already typing furiously on her laptop. The user metrics tell a different story. Their engagement rates are dropping while ours keep climbing. "It's not just about the numbers," Burke interjected from his position near the kitchen door. He'd arrived unnoticed during the news clip. "Sterling's trying to use your past against you, Tommy, but he doesn't realize he's just given us an opportunity." Tommy looked up from the feedback forms, his expression thoughtful. "You know what's interesting? In all of Sterling's marketing, they never actually talk to kids about money. They talk about teaching kids about money, but they never listen to what kids have to say." Michael set down his tablet, a spark of inspiration in his eyes. "You're right, and that's exactly what makes our program different." He turned to Burke. "What if we launched a series of video testimonials? Not just from kids using the program, but from parents, teachers, financial counselors who've seen the results. Better yet," Mrs. Chen added, "why not organize a youth financial literacy summit? Give kids a platform to share their experiences and challenges. Show that we're not just teaching, we're listening." Harrison watched as the idea took hold, the room buzzing with renewed energy. This was so different from his old business world of hostile takeovers and corporate maneuvering. Here, success wasn't measured in profit margins alone, but in lives impacted and lessons learned. "There's something else," Sarah said, looking up from her laptop. "I've been analyzing Sterling's program code, what's publicly available anyway. Their certified financial experts have built in the same kind of reward mechanisms that got Tommy into trouble in the first place. They're basically training kids to respond to financial dopamine hits." Tommy's face hardened. "That's exactly what those games did to me. They made spending money feel good like winning, but it wasn't winning at all. He stood up, pacing the small room with nervous energy. We need to show people what's really happening. Careful, Harrison warned, his business instincts kicking in. Sterling's lawyers will be looking for any excuse to come after us. Then we'll be smart about it, Burke said, pulling up a chair. Instead of attacking their program, we'll educate parents about what to look for in financial literacy software. Help them make informed decisions. Michael nodded slowly. We could develop a parent's guide, showing the psychological impacts of different gaming mechanics on children's financial behavior. Everything backed by research and real-world examples. As they discussed strategies, Harrison noticed Tommy had grown quiet, staring at the news clip still frozen on Mrs. Chen's phone. Sterling's face filled the screen, radiating corporate confidence and authority. "You okay, champ?" Harrison asked softly. Tommy looked up, and Harrison was struck by the maturity in his grandson's eyes. "You know what's weird, Grandpa? A year ago, seeing someone like him in a fancy suit, talking about success, it would have made me feel so small. But now..." He gestured at their modest living room, at the people working together to build something meaningful. "Now I know that success doesn't look like what I thought it did." Harrison pulled his grandson into a tight hug, remembering the broken boy who had once hidden from the world, crushed by guilt and shame. That boy had grown into someone stronger, wiser, and more compassionate than any amount of money could have produced. The idea for the Youth Financial Literacy Summit took shape faster than anyone had anticipated. The community center, which had hosted their first presentation, offered their largest space free of charge. Local businesses, impressed by the program's impact, stepped forward with sponsorships. Even the mayor's office expressed interest in attending. Harrison found himself in a familiar role, coordinating logistics and managing relationships, but this time with a profound difference. Instead of focusing on profit margins and market share, every decision centered on their core mission: helping young people understand and manage money responsibly. "The registration numbers are incredible," Michael reported during their morning planning session. "We've had to start a waiting list." He showed Tommy the spreadsheet of registered attendees. "Look at this. Kids are coming from 3 different states." Tommy was barely listening, focused intently on his presentation draft. The summit would be his biggest challenge yet, speaking to hundreds of his peers about financial responsibility. "Dad," he asked suddenly, "do you think we should invite Sterling Industries?" The question caught everyone off guard. Harrison looked up from his paperwork, studying his grandson's expression. "Why would you want to do that, Tommy?" "Because this isn't about beating them," Tommy explained, choosing his words carefully. "It's about helping kids. Maybe if they see what we're really trying to do, they'll understand why their approach is wrong." Michael shared a look with Harrison, pride and concern mingling in his expression. "That's very mature of you, son, but Sterling might try to use this against us somehow." "Or," Burke interjected from his usual spot near the kitchen, "they might refuse to come, which would speak volumes about their real priorities." He smiled at Tommy. "Either way, extending the invitation is the right thing to do." Sarah, who had been quietly coding in the corner, spoke up. "We could live stream the summit too. Let parents and educators who can't attend in person see what real financial education looks like." The day of the summit arrived with a mix of nervous energy and excitement. The community center's main hall had been transformed, with breakout sessions led by kids sharing their experiences with money and gaming. Parents and educators moved between sessions, many taking notes and asking thoughtful questions. Tommy's keynote speech was scheduled for the afternoon. As he prepared backstage, Harrison noticed his grandson's hands shaking slightly. "Having second thoughts about that invitation?" he asked gently. "No," Tommy replied, adjusting his tie, the same one Mrs. Wilson had given him. "But I just found out Sterling actually sent representatives. They're sitting in the front row." Before Harrison could respond, a commotion near the entrance caught their attention. Through the crowd, they spotted Victor Sterling himself striding in, flanked by his usual entourage. The businessman's presence commanded attention, but Harrison noticed something different in his rival's bearing, a hint of uncertainty perhaps, even curiosity. "Ladies and gentlemen," the moderator announced, "please welcome our keynote speaker, Tommy Montgomery." Tommy walked onto the stage, and Harrison held his breath. But his grandson didn't seem fazed by Sterling's presence. Instead, he began with a story, not about losing their fortune, but about the first time he understood the value of money. "I was 7, Tommy said, his voice clear and confident. "And I wanted a new bike. My mom told me I'd have to save my allowance. It took 6 months, and every week I had to choose between saving and buying candy or games. When I finally bought that bike, it meant something because I understood what it cost, not just in money, but in choices." He went on to explain how that early lesson had gotten lost in the sophisticated manipulation of online games. But instead of dwelling on past mistakes, he focused on solutions, demonstrating how their program helped kids understand the real-world impact of financial decisions. "The truth is," Tommy continued, looking directly at the Sterling Industries representatives, "we don't need to trick kids into learning about money. We just need to give them the tools to understand it and trust them to make informed choices." As Tommy spoke, Harrison watched Sterling's expression change from skeptical to thoughtful. The businessman leaned forward slightly, actually engaging with the presentation rather than dismissing it. During the Q&A session, Sterling himself stood up. The room fell silent, tension thick in the air. But his question wasn't confrontational. "You've clearly put a lot of thought into the psychological aspects of financial education," he said. "Have you considered how this approach might be adapted for different age groups?" Tommy blinked in surprise, but recovered quickly. "Actually, yes. We've been working on modules for different developmental stages. Would you like to see our research on that?" What followed was an actual dialogue, not about competition or market share, but about the real challenges of teaching financial literacy to young people. Harrison watched in amazement as his grandson and his old rival found common ground in their shared goal of education, even if their approaches differed. The aftermath of the Youth Financial Literacy Summit brought unexpected developments. Harrison sat in their living room, reviewing an email that had arrived that morning from Victor Sterling's office. The message was brief, but significant. Sterling Industries was interested in discussing potential collaboration opportunities. "What do you think it means?" Michael asked, reading over his father's shoulder. The skepticism in his voice reflected years of distrust toward their former rival. "Could be another attempt to undermine us." Tommy looked up from his laptop, where he was analyzing user feedback from the summit. Or maybe he actually listened to what we had to say. The teenager's optimism hadn't wavered since the surprising exchange at the summit. "Did you see his face when those kids were sharing their stories?" He looked different. Harrison was about to respond when their doorbell rang. Mrs. Chen entered, followed by her son Sarah, and, to everyone's surprise, Jason Burke, who rarely arrived unannounced. "You've all seen the email, I assume?" Burke asked, not waiting for pleasantries. His expression was unreadable as he settled into what had become his usual chair. "Sterling's reached out to me as well." Sarah pulled out her tablet, already accessing their project data. "Our user base has doubled since the summit. Schools that were on the fence about implementing our program are now fully committed. Whatever Sterling's planning, we're in a strong position." "But that's just it," Tommy interjected, turning his laptop around to show them something. "Look at Sterling Industries' website. They've already started changing their program. The manipulative gaming elements we criticized, they're being removed." The group huddled around Tommy's screen, examining the changes. The flashy animations and addictive reward systems were indeed being replaced with more straightforward educational content. It was subtle, but significant. "They're learning from us," Michael said softly, wonder mixing with disbelief in his voice. "They're actually taking our feedback seriously." Harrison sat back, memories flooding his mind. He remembered countless boardroom battles with Victor Sterling, each man convinced of his own superiority. But now, watching his grandson's influence reshape their rival's approach, he wondered if perhaps they had all been fighting the wrong battle all along. "I think we should meet with them," Tommy said firmly. The room fell silent, all eyes turning to him. Not to compete or negotiate, but to collaborate. Isn't helping kids more important than winning some old rivalry? Mrs. Chen, who had been quietly observing, spoke up. Tommy's right. From what I've seen in the community center, kids don't care which program they're using. They just want to understand how to handle money responsibly. Burke nodded slowly. Sterling Industries has resources and reach that would take us years to build. If they're genuinely willing to learn from our approach. But can we trust them? Michael asked, the protective father evident in his tone. After everything they've done. Harrison stood and walked to the window, looking out at their modest neighborhood. The morning sun cast long shadows across their small front yard, where Tommy's bike leaned against the porch, not the expensive models he used to have, but one he'd saved for himself from his first earnings helping neighbors with yard work. You know, Harrison began, turning back to the group, I've been thinking about what real success looks like. When I built my first fortune, I thought it was about winning, about proving I was better than competitors like Sterling. But watching Tommy these past months, seeing how he's turned his mistake into something that helps others, he paused, emotion threatening to overtake his voice. Maybe it's time we all learned a new way of doing business. Tommy moved to stand beside his grandfather. The old Harrison Montgomery would never have considered working with Victor Sterling, he said with a small smile. But you're not the same person anymore, are you, Grandpa? None of us are. Michael joined them, placing a hand on his son's shoulder. The question is, has Sterling changed too? Or is this just another business strategy? There's one way to find out, Burke suggested, already pulling out his phone. Let's arrange that meeting, but this time we set the terms. We meet here, in your home where this all started. Let Sterling see firsthand what we're building and why it matters. Sarah was already typing on her tablet. We should prepare a comprehensive presentation of our user data, showing the real impact we're having. Numbers don't lie, even to businessmen like Sterling. As they discussed the logistics of the potential meeting, Harrison watched his grandson return to his laptop, immediately diving back into user feedback and feature improvements. The boy who had once lost millions in online games was now teaching others about financial responsibility, and in the process might even help heal a decades-old business rivalry. Mrs. Chen began arranging snacks in the kitchen, her presence a reminder of how their lives had changed. Their new wealth wasn't measured in bank accounts or property holdings, but in the relationships they'd built and the lives they were impacting. One condition, Harrison said finally, drawing everyone's attention. If we do this, we make it clear that Tommy's vision leads the way. This isn't about corporate mergers or market share. It's about doing what's right for the kids who need this program. Tommy looked up, surprise and gratitude mixing in his expression. A year ago, he'd been crushed by the weight of his mistakes. Now he was leading them all towards something bigger than themselves. The transformation wasn't just in their circumstances, Harrison realized, but in their understanding of what truly mattered. The day of the meeting with Sterling arrived with an unusual energy in the Montgomery household. Their modest living room had been rearranged to accommodate the upcoming discussion, though they deliberately kept it casual. No corporate boardroom setup, just comfortable seating arranged to encourage open dialogue. Mrs. Chen had outdone herself with refreshments, filling the house with the aroma of freshly baked cookies and coffee. Kids learn better with cookies, she declared, arranging them on a plate. Even grown-up kids who run big companies. Tommy sat at the kitchen table, reviewing his presentation one last time. He'd insisted on leading the discussion, and no one had argued. This was his vision, after all. The rest of them were just helping bring it to life. Remember, Michael coached, helping his son straighten his tie, you don't need to impress them with business jargon. Just speak from the heart like you did at the summit. The doorbell rang precisely at 10 o'clock. Harrison opened it to find Victor Sterling standing there, looking somewhat out of place in their working-class neighborhood. But something was different about his old rival. The usual arrogance was tempered by what appeared to be genuine curiosity. Harrison, Sterling nodded, then surprised everyone by adding, "Thank you for having us in your home." He was accompanied by only two people, his head of development and, unexpectedly, his teenage daughter Emma, whom Harrison had never met. Tommy stepped forward, professional but warm. "Welcome, Mr. Sterling. We've set up in the living room." He gestured to the comfortable seating area, where Sarah and Burke were already waiting with their laptops ready. As they settled in, Sterling's daughter Emma spoke up. "I asked to come today," she explained, looking directly at Tommy. "Your presentation at the summit, it made me think about things differently, about how I use money, about what I'm learning from those games I play." The atmosphere in the room shifted subtly. This wasn't just a business meeting anymore. It was becoming something more personal, more meaningful. Tommy began his presentation, but instead of focusing on market statistics or competition, he shared stories. He talked about the messages they'd received from kids who had finally understood why their parents said no to certain purchases. He showed videos of families using their program together, learning and growing as a unit. "The thing is," Tommy explained, pulling up their latest user interface, "we're not just teaching kids about money, we're helping families talk about it. Honestly, look at this feature we added based on user feedback." He demonstrated their new family discussion module, which prompted meaningful conversations about financial decisions. Sterling's development head leaned forward, clearly impressed. "By the intuitive design, our programmers spent weeks trying to create engaging content," Sterling admitted, watching the demonstration. "But we were so focused on gamification that we missed the human element entirely." Emma pulled out her phone, showing her father something. "Dad, remember when I spent all that money on in-app purchases last year? If I'd had something like this then—" She trailed off, but her meaning was clear. Sterling was quiet for a moment, studying his daughter's face. When he spoke again, his voice carried a new tone, one of humility that Harrison had never heard before. "I've been in this business for 30 years, Sterling said, addressing the room but looking at Tommy. "I've built educational software, financial platforms, gaming systems, but I've never seen anything quite like this." He turned to Harrison. "Your grandson has created something remarkable here, something that could genuinely change how we teach financial literacy to the next generation." Burke leaned forward. "That's why we agreed to this meeting. We believe that with Sterling Industries' resources and our approach, we could reach even more families. But," Harrison interjected firmly, "only if the core mission remains intact. This isn't about profits or market share. It's about helping kids make better choices than we did." Sterling nodded slowly, then did something that shocked everyone. In the room, he smiled genuinely and without pretense. "You know, Harrison, losing your fortune might have been the best thing that ever happened to your family. Look what it created." He gestured around the modest living room at the people gathered there with a common purpose. "You're richer now than you ever were in that mansion." Tommy's eyes widened at this unexpected acknowledgement. Mrs. Chen, who had been quietly observing from the kitchen doorway, wiped away a tear. "So," Sterling continued, his business acumen returning but tempered now with something new: respect. "Let's talk about how we can work together. Not as competitors, not as rivals, but as partners in something important. Emma," he turned to his daughter, "would you like to be part of our youth advisory board? Help us understand what kids your age really need." As the discussion continued, evolving from cautious negotiation into enthusiastic collaboration, Harrison watched his grandson guide the conversation with wisdom beyond his years. The boy who had once lost millions through impulsive gaming was now teaching one of the city's most powerful businessmen about the true value of money, and more importantly, about the value of purpose over profit. The partnership with Sterling Industries brought rapid changes to their once modest operation. Their living room headquarters had been relocated to a small but professional office space, courtesy of Sterling, though Tommy insisted on keeping their weekly family meetings at home. "Some things," he'd said firmly, "need to stay personal." On this particular morning, Harrison arrived at the office to find Tommy already there, surrounded by the youth advisory board he now led. Emma Sterling sat among them, her initial shyness replaced by passionate involvement in their mission. The teens were deeply engaged in discussion, their energy filling the room. "The middle school feedback is amazing," Emma was saying, gesturing at her tablet. "But high school students want something more sophisticated. They're asking about cryptocurrency and investment basics." Tommy nodded, making notes. "We need to be careful, though. Remember what happened to me with online trading? We can't just teach them how to invest. We need to teach them when not to. Harrison paused in the doorway, struck by the maturity in his grandson's voice. The past month had brought tremendous growth, not just to their project, but to Tommy himself. The guilty, withdrawn boy was now a confident young leader who spoke at educational conferences and advised school boards. Michael entered behind Harrison, carrying coffee for everyone, a habit he'd maintained despite their new success. "Morning, team," he called out, distributing the cups. "How's the high school module coming along?" Before anyone could answer, Sarah burst in, her usually calm demeanor ruffled. "We have a situation," she announced, pulling up something on the main screen. "Someone's been examining our code a little too closely." The room fell silent as they read the tech blog post displayed. On the screen, a prominent software reviewer had published a detailed analysis of their program, highlighting similarities between certain base functions and Sterling Industries' original code. "They're suggesting we stole elements from Sterling's future smart kids," Sarah explained, her voice tight with concern. "The article's gaining traction online." Tommy's face paled. "But that's impossible. We built everything from scratch. Mr. Sterling has seen our development process." "It's not about truth," Burke said, entering the room with his phone pressed to his ear. "It's about perception. And right now the perception is that the big bad corporation might be taking advantage of the underdog story." He covered his phone's microphone. "Victor's trying to handle it, but the story's already spreading." Harrison watched as Tommy slumped in his chair, the weight of another potential scandal visible in his posture. But before anyone could offer comfort, the teenager straightened up, a determined look replacing his momentary defeat. "Let's live stream our development process," he suggested, causing everyone to stare at him. "Complete transparency. Show exactly how we build each feature, explain our design choices. Let people see that we're doing this our own way." Emma's eyes lit up. "We could make it educational too, like a behind-the-scenes look at how financial education software is created. My social media followers would love that," Michael shared, a proud look with Harrison. Their crisis management strategy was being shaped by teenagers who understood modern transparency better than any corporate PR team. "There's more," Sarah added, scrolling through her notifications. "Some parents are questioning whether Tommy's qualified to lead this project, given his history with online spending." Tommy stood up, walking to the window that overlooked the busy street below. For a moment, Harrison saw a flash of the old insecurity cross his grandson's face. But when Tommy turned back to the room, his expression was resolute. "They're right to question it," he said quietly. "My mistakes cost our family everything, but that's exactly why I'm qualified to do this. I understand these kids because I was these kids." Emma stepped forward, placing a supportive hand on Tommy's shoulder. "And that's why we trust you. You're not some adult telling us what to do. You're someone who learned the hard way and wants to help others avoid the same mistakes." The room buzzed with renewed energy as the team began planning their transparency initiative. Harrison watched as Tommy and Emma led the discussion, their young voices full of innovative ideas that no corporate boardroom could have generated. Mrs. Chen arrived with her usual impeccable timing, carrying a basket of fresh muffins. "I thought, our young executives might need brain food," she said with a warm smile. "The community center kids are asking when Tommy's coming back to teach another workshop." "Actually," Tommy said, a new idea lighting up his face, "what if we did the live stream from the community center? Show how we're developing this program with input from real kids in real communities." Michael was already pulling up the center's schedule on his phone. "We could set up multiple camera angles, show the coding process alongside the user testing, and invite some of the kids who've been helped by the program to share their stories," Emma added excitedly. "My dad always says the best defense is a good offense." Harrison observed the scene with a mixture of pride and amazement. Their setback had instantly transformed into an opportunity for greater connection with their user base. In his old business life, such a crisis would have meant closed-door meetings and carefully crafted press releases. But here, transparency wasn't just a strategy, it was a natural extension of their mission. The community center hummed with activity as volunteers transformed the main room into a makeshift production studio. Local teens, many of whom had been part of their original focus group, helped set up chairs and run cables under Sarah's direction. The energy was infectious, turning what could have been a defensive response to criticism into a celebration of their grassroots origins. "Testing, testing," Tommy spoke into the microphone while Emma adjusted the lighting. They had decided to begin the live stream with a candid discussion about the program's development, followed by a live demonstration of their coding process. Harrison stood at the back of the room with Victor Sterling, who had arrived minutes earlier with a team of social media experts. "This is quite different from our usual crisis management approach," Sterling observed, watching the teenagers work. "Everything about this project has been different," Harrison replied. "That's why it works." The live stream began with Tommy addressing the controversy head-on. "Yes, I made mistakes with money," he said, looking directly into the camera. "Yes, I nearly ruined my family through online spending. But that experience taught me something valuable, something I want to share with others." As Tommy spoke, Michael and Sarah set up their development environment on the main screen. Local kids who had been using the program began sharing their stories one after another, stepping up to the microphone. "Before this program, I thought being good with money meant being rich," a young girl explained. "Now I understand it's about making smart choices, no matter how much you have." Emma's social media expertise proved invaluable as she moderated the online chat, sharing questions and comments from viewers around the country. The transparency of their approach was drawing attention, positive attention that no corporate PR strategy could have manufactured. "Look at this," she called out excitedly. "Teachers are asking if they can use the live stream recording in their classes. They say it's a perfect example of turning mistakes into opportunities." As the afternoon progressed, something unexpected began to happen. Other developers started joining the chat, offering suggestions and encouraging their approach. Even some of their critics began acknowledging the value of their open development process. Mrs. Chen moved through the crowd with refreshments, pausing to share stories about how the program had impacted families in their neighborhood. Her presence reminded everyone that this wasn't just about software development, it was about community. "You know what's remarkable?" Burke said quietly to Harrison. "A month ago, these kids were just users of the program. Now, they're part of its development. They're invested in its success because they've seen how it helps their friends and families." Victor Sterling watched as his daughter confidently guided the online discussion, her usual reserve replaced by a passionate engagement. "I've spent years trying to connect with young users," he admitted, "but I never thought to simply listen to them." The livestream's chat exploded with activity when Tommy began demonstrating how they designed their latest feature, a family discussion module that helped parents and kids talk about money without conflict. Viewers could see the actual code being written, while local families tested the interface in real time. "See this part?" Tommy explained, pointing to a section of code. "We added this because a kid in our focus group said he was afraid to tell his parents when he made a mistake with money. Now the program helps families create a safe space for those conversations." Michael stepped forward, adding his perspective. "As both a developer and a parent, every feature we create comes from real experiences, real needs. We're not just teaching financial literacy, we're helping families communicate better." A comment from a viewer caught Emma's attention. "Someone's asking about the similarities with Sterling Industries code," she announced, addressing the elephant in the room. Tommy didn't hesitate. "Mr. Sterling, would you like to address that?" Victor Sterling stepped into frame, his presence commanding but not overwhelming. "Our companies are partners because we share a goal, helping young people make better financial decisions. Any similarities in our code come from that shared mission, not from copying or theft." As the live stream continued, Harrison noticed Tommy taking a moment to step away from the cameras. He found his grandson staring at the community center's bulletin board, covered with thank you notes from program users. "Everything okay, champ?" Harrison asked softly. Tommy turned, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "You know what, Grandpa? A year ago I thought I'd destroyed our family, but look at this." He gestured around the room at the dozens of people working together, sharing stories, building something meaningful. We lost our fortune, but we found something better. We found purpose. Harrison pulled his grandson into a tight hug, remembering the dark days after their financial fall. Who could have guessed that their greatest loss would lead to their most meaningful victory? Not in terms of money or status, but in the lives they were touching, the communities they were building, and the family bonds they were strengthening. The success of the livestream initiative had ripple effects that none of them had anticipated. Their small office now buzzed with energy as schools across the country reached out for custom implementations of their program. Tommy's inbox was flooded with speaking invitations from educational conferences, and even financial institutions were taking notice. On this particular morning, Harrison arrived to find Tommy and Emma deep in discussion with a group of international students on a video call. The program had caught the attention of educators overseas, and adaptation requests were pouring in from multiple countries. The cultural differences in how families discuss money are fascinating, Emma was explaining. Taking notes as the students shared their perspectives, we need to make the program flexible enough to respect these variations. Tommy nodded, his expression thoughtful. Maybe we could create cultural modules that adapt the content while keeping the core principles intact. He sketched something quickly on his tablet. Like this, see how the interface could adjust based on local customs and values. Harrison watched from the doorway, marveling at how naturally his grandson had grown into his role as a young executive. The insecure boy who had once hidden from his mistakes was now confidently leading international discussions about financial education. Michael entered the office, carrying his usual coffee tray, but today his expression was different, a mix of excitement and nostalgia. "Dad," he called out quietly to Harrison, "you might want to see this." He handed over his tablet, displaying a real estate listing that made Harrison's heart skip a beat. It was their old estate. "Sterling's putting it up for sale," Michael explained, softly. He mentioned it during yesterday's board meeting, said something about downsizing to focus on what matters. Before Harrison could respond, Mrs. Chen burst into the office, her usual calm demeanor replaced by barely contained excitement. "Have you seen the news?" she asked, brandishing her phone. "Your program just won the Global Education Innovation Award." The announcement drew everyone's attention. Tommy and Emma ended their video call, joining the growing crowd around Mrs. Chen's phone. The prestigious award was rarely given to programs less than a year old, making their win even more significant. "But that's not all," Mrs. Chen continued, her eyes twinkling. "The ceremony is being held at the International Education Summit next month in our city." The news sparked immediate excitement, but Harrison noticed Tommy had grown quiet, staring out the window with an unreadable expression. He approached his grandson, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "What's on your mind, champ?" Tommy turned, his eyes reflecting a maturity that sometimes caught Harrison off guard. "The summit's main venue. It's the Sterling Convention Center. Isn't it? Right across from our old estate." Harrison nodded, understanding the weight of emotion in his grandson's voice. They hadn't been back to that part of town since losing their home. The thought of returning now, under such different circumstances, carried a powerful symbolism. "You know what's weird, Grandpa?" Tommy continued, his voice thoughtful. "A year ago, going back there would have felt like facing failure. But now," he gestured around their busy office, at the international students still visible on the video screen, at the wall of thank you letters from families their program had helped. "Now it feels like we're returning with something more valuable than what we lost." Sarah approached with her laptop, interrupting the moment. "Sorry, but you both need to see this. The award announcement is trending, and look at the comments." She scrolled through pages of responses from program users around the world, each sharing how the software had impacted their families. "My daughter finally understands why we budget," one parent wrote. "This program didn't just teach her about money, it helped us communicate better as a family. I used to hide my spending from my parents," a teenager shared. "Now we have weekly financial check-ins, and I'm actually saving for college." Emma joined them, adding her own perspective. "Dad says the corporate board was skeptical about partnering with a program led by teenagers. Now they're using our success as a case study in their business school lectures." Michael wrapped an arm around his son's shoulders, pride evident in his expression. You've created something extraordinary here, Tommy. Something that goes beyond money or business success. Mrs. Chen, who had been quietly observing, spoke up. You know what impresses me most? The way you've kept the community center workshops going even with all this international attention. You haven't forgotten where this all started. Harrison watched as Tommy absorbed these words, seeing in his grandson's face the perfect balance of pride and humility. The boy had learned lessons that most adults never grasp, that true success isn't measured in dollars, that mistakes can become stepping stones, and that the most valuable growth often comes from unexpected directions. The Sterling Convention Center loomed before them, its glass facade reflecting the early morning sun. Harrison adjusted his tie, a simple one compared to those he used to wear, but somehow it felt more meaningful. The International Education Summit was about to begin, and their program was the talk of the conference. Tommy stood beside him, looking sharp in his new suit, a gift from the community center families who had pooled their resources to ensure he was properly dressed for the award ceremony. The gesture had brought tears to everyone's eyes, a powerful reminder of how their community had become family. Ready? Michael asked, joining them at the entrance. He had spent the previous evening helping Tommy refine his acceptance speech, though both father and son knew the words would come from the heart when the moment arrived. Inside, the convention center buzzed with educators, developers, and students from around the world. Emma rushed over to greet them, her tablet displaying the day's schedule. The youth panel is packed, she announced excitedly. Every seat taken, standing room only. As they made their way through the crowd, Harrison couldn't help but notice how many people recognized Tommy, stopping to share how the program had impacted their schools and communities. His grandson handled each interaction with genuine interest and humility, never forgetting to credit their team and community supporters. Mr. Montgomery, a voice called out, and they turned to find Victor Sterling approaching, looking different than Harrison remembered. The sharp corporate edge was gone, replaced by something more authentic. Could we speak privately for a moment? Harrison followed his former rival to a quiet corner, curious about what Sterling might have to say. The man seemed to struggle with his words for a moment, something Harrison had never seen before. I've been doing a lot of thinking, Sterling finally began, about success, about legacy, about what really matters. He paused, gathering his thoughts. That estate, your old home, I bought it out of spite, thinking it would be the ultimate victory. But watching your family these past months, seeing how you've turned loss into something meaningful, he shook his head, smiling ruefully. Well, it made me realize I was measuring success all wrong. Before Harrison could respond, Sterling continued, I'm not selling the estate, I'm donating it actually, to be converted into a youth financial education center. If you're willing, I'd like your family to help design the programs we'll offer. There, Harrison stood speechless, memories of their past rivalry mixing with the potential of this unexpected opportunity. Before he could formulate a response, Tommy's voice came from behind them. It should have a community garden, his grandson said, joining the conversation. Like the one great-grandma Elizabeth used to tend, a place where kids can learn that growth takes time and care, whether you're growing roses or building savings. Sterling's face lit up with genuine enthusiasm. Yes, exactly. Hand classroom spaces where we can run those workshops you've been doing at the community center, but on a larger scale. The two began exchanging ideas rapidly, their age difference forgotten in their shared vision. Harrison watched in amazement as his grandson and former rival planned together, their enthusiasm drawing others into the discussion. Sarah appeared with her laptop, already sketching possible layouts for the technology labs. Emma joined in, suggesting ways to incorporate outdoor learning spaces. Even Mrs. Chen, who had arrived to support Tommy at the award ceremony, offered insights about making the center welcoming to families from all backgrounds. Michael pulled Harrison aside, both watching the scene unfold. You know, Dad, he said, softly, when we lost everything, I thought it was the end of our family's legacy. I never imagined this would be our new beginning. Harrison nodded, understanding exactly what his son meant. Their family had always been proud of their financial success, but this was something different, something more meaningful than money could ever be. The announcement for the award ceremony interrupted their conversation, calling everyone to the main hall. As they took their seats, Harrison found himself seated between Michael and Mrs. Chen, surrounded by the community that had helped them rebuild not just their lives, but their understanding of what truly matters. Tommy approached the podium, looking out over the packed auditorium. But instead of beginning his prepared speech, he did something unexpected. He asked everyone who had been impacted by their program to stand. Slowly, people began rising. Students, parents, teachers, entire families who had learned to communicate better about money through their software. The visual impact was powerful, but Tommy wasn't finished. "Now," he said, his voice clear and confident, "I want everyone who helped create this program to stand, not just our development team, but everyone who offered feedback, who shared their stories, who believed in what we were trying to do." More people stood, including their entire community center group, Mrs. Chen and her family, the Sterling Industries team, and countless others who had contributed in ways big and small. Spring had returned to their old estate, but this time the changes it brought were different. Where tennis courts had briefly replaced Elizabeth's beloved rose garden, teams of landscapers were now carefully restoring the grounds according to Tommy's vision for the new financial education center. Harrison stood at the edge of what would become the community garden, watching as his grandson directed volunteers in laying out plots for different plant varieties. Each section would serve as a practical lesson in growth, patience, and investment. Concepts that Tommy had learned to appreciate in ways his younger self never could have imagined. "The seedlings need time," Tommy was explaining to a group of eager students who had volunteered to help. "Just like your savings, you can't rush either one if you want them to grow strong." His easy confidence with the younger kids still amazed Harrison. How naturally he had stepped into the role of mentor. Michael approached, blueprint tablets under his arm. His architectural background had proved invaluable in redesigning the mansion's interior spaces. "The contractor says we're ahead of schedule," he reported, pulling up the latest plans. "The East Wing's technology labs should be ready for equipment installation next week." Emma Sterling appeared from around the corner, leading a film crew that had been documenting the center's development. "This is going to make such a great segment for our educational channel," she said enthusiastically, "showing how we're literally growing financial literacy from the ground up." The transformation of the estate had become a community project that bridged old social divides. Harrison observed Mrs. Chen organizing refreshments for the volunteers while chatting with some of their former high society neighbors who had joined the effort. The same people who had once whispered about the Montgomerys' fall from grace were now eager participants in their new mission. "Mr. Montgomery?" A young voice interrupted his thoughts. A teenage boy stood nervously before him holding a tablet. "I'm doing a school project about business transformations, and I was wondering, could you tell me about how it felt to lose everything and then find a different kind of success?" Harrison glanced at Tommy, who had paused in his gardening to listen. Their eyes met in understanding. This was exactly the kind of teaching moment their center was meant to create. "Come walk with me," Harrison invited the student, heading toward the greenhouse that was being constructed. "You see, true wealth isn't always what we think it is. Sometimes it takes losing everything material to discover what really matters." As they walked, he shared their story, not as a cautionary tale of loss, but as a journey of discovery. He told the boy about Tommy's transformation from a teenager caught in the trap of online spending to a leader helping others avoid the same pitfalls. He explained how their family had found strength not in isolation, but in community. "The interesting thing," Harrison concluded, "is that when we lived here before, these grounds were private, a symbol of our success. Now they're becoming something much more valuable, a place where anyone can come to learn, grow, and build a better future." The boy was scribbling notes frantically. "But weren't you angry when you lost it all?" "Of course," Harrison admitted. "Honestly. But anger doesn't build anything worthwhile. Look around. Everything you see here started because my grandson chose to learn from his mistakes instead of being defined by them." Their conversation was interrupted by Sarah's arrival. She hurried over, tablet in hand, excitement visible on her face. "The registration numbers for our summer programs just came in," she announced. "We're going to need more space than we planned. Families are signing up from all over the country." Tommy joined them, wiping garden soil from his hands. "Maybe we could set up temporary classrooms in the garden, make it a real outdoor learning experience?" His mind was already working on solutions, proving once again how far he'd come from the boy who once sought escape in virtual worlds. Victor Sterling arrived later that afternoon for their weekly project review. He moved differently now, Harrison noticed, less like a corporate titan and more like a man who had discovered a new purpose. The rivalry that had once consumed them both felt like a relic from another life. "The board approved the additional funding for the expansion," Sterling announced without preamble. "But more importantly, other companies are asking about implementing similar programs. This could become a national model." Tommy looked up from where he was showing some younger kids how to plant tomato seedlings. "As long as we don't lose sight of what makes it work," he said firmly. "It's not about the fancy facilities or the technology. It's about helping people understand their relationship with money before they learn hard lessons the way I did." Harrison watched as his grandson returned to his teaching, noting how the younger children hung on his every word. Tommy had found his calling, not in spite of his past mistakes, but because of how he'd chosen to learn from them. The morning of the Education Center's official opening arrived with a sense of anticipation that filled the restored mansion's halls. Sunlight streamed through the newly installed windows, illuminating spaces that had been transformed from symbols of private wealth into resources for public good. Tommy stood in what had once been his grandfather's study, now converted into a collaborative learning space where students would work together on financial projects. The old mahogany desk had been replaced by modern workstations, but one wall still held the original Montgomery family portrait, no longer as a symbol of status, but as a reminder of how far they had come. "Nervous?" Michael asked, joining his son. They both wore simple blazers with the center's logo, a growing plant surrounded by binary code representing the blend of technology and natural growth that defined their approach. "Not nervous," Tommy replied, adjusting a display screen. "Just thinking about how different everything is. Remember when I used to hide in here after spending too much on games?" He smiled at the memory. "Now we're teaching kids how to understand those same psychological tricks that got me in trouble." The first visitors were already gathering outside, families, educators, and community members who had supported their journey. Mrs. Chen had organized a welcome celebration that reflected their program's inclusive spirit, with food and traditions from various cultures represented. Emma arrived with her film crew, but today they weren't just documenting, they were launching a live educational channel that would broadcast workshops and lessons from the center to schools worldwide. "The streaming setup is ready," she reported. "We're already getting viewers logging in from different time zones." Sarah and her development team had set up interactive displays throughout the mansion, each demonstrating different aspects of financial literacy through engaging, non-manipulative gaming elements. "Remember to emphasize that our software adapts to family circumstances," she reminded everyone. "We're not prescribing one path. We're helping each family find their own way." Harrison observed the activity from the grand staircase, remembering how he used to descend these steps feeling like a king in his castle. Now watching students and parents flow through the entrance, the space felt more alive, more meaningful than it ever had during their wealthy days. Victor Sterling arrived with a group of business leaders who had supported the center's development. "These executives all thought I was crazy," he confided to Harrison with a chuckle, "turning prime real estate into an education center, but now they're seeing the bigger picture." The opening ceremony began in the garden, where Tommy's carefully planned botanical lessons were already taking root. Young plants stretched toward the sun, each plot labeled with financial concepts that parallel their growth patterns. Compound interest demonstrated through spreading herbs, diversification shown through companion planting. "Welcome to your center," Tommy began his address, emphasizing the word "your" as he faced the gathered crowd. "Not the Montgomery Center, not the Sterling Center, but a place that belongs to everyone who wants to learn, grow, and help others do the same." As he spoke, Harrison noticed a familiar face in the crowd, Jason Burke, who had believed in them when they had nothing but an idea and determination. Burke caught his eye and nodded, a gesture that acknowledged how far they'd come from those first uncertain meetings in their small rental house. The ceremony continued with demonstrations of their programs, but what really captured attention were the testimonials from early participants. A teenage girl described how the center's workshops had helped her family avoid foreclosure. A young boy proudly showed off the saving system he'd developed using their app. Michael led tours of the facility, explaining how each space had been redesigned with purpose. The former ballroom was now a conference center for financial literacy seminars. The kitchen hosted classes on practical budget management and sustainable living. Even the servants' quarters had been repurposed as dormitories for students attending intensive workshops from other cities. "You've created something remarkable here," Sterling said quietly to Harrison as they watched Tommy lead an impromptu workshop for some eager kids. "Something that will outlast all our business achievements." Harrison nodded, understanding perfectly. Their legacy was no longer measured in dollar signs, but in lives changed, lessons learned, and wisdom shared. The mansion that had once represented their greatest loss had become the foundation for their most meaningful contribution. As the day progressed, Harrison found himself in the garden, standing beside the newly planted rose bushes that honored Elizabeth's memory. Tommy joined him, garden soil still under his fingernails from showing children how to plant their first seeds. "You know what, Grandpa?" Tommy said thoughtfully. "I used to think losing our money was the worst thing that could happen to us, but now I realize it was actually the best. We just had to learn how to grow something new from what we lost." 6 months after the center's opening, the gardens were in full bloom, mirroring the growth and success of their educational programs. Harrison walked the grounds early one morning, appreciating how the autumn sun caught the dew on Elizabeth's roses, now thriving under the care of students who had embraced Tommy's philosophy of patience and nurturing. Inside the center, the usual buzz of activity was amplified by excitement over their latest achievement. Their program had just been adopted by the state's educational board as a mandatory part of the high school curriculum. More importantly, other states were following suit, recognizing the unique value of their approach. "The latest data is incredible," Sarah announced during their morning meeting, displaying charts that showed the program's impact. Participating families show a 70% increase in positive financial behaviors, and student debt awareness has dramatically improved in schools using our curriculum. Tommy sat at the head of the conference table, no longer the guilty teenager, but a respected young educator whose insights were sought by financial institutions and education experts alike. "But the numbers I really care about are these," he said, pulling up a different screen showing messages from program participants. "My dad and I finally had an honest conversation about college costs," one student had written. "Instead of just arguing about money, we made a plan together using your family budget tools." Emma, who had become an integral part of their team, added her own report. "The educational channel has over 1 million subscribers now. Our weekly family financial discussions are being watched in homes across the globe." Michael arrived carrying architectural plans for their first satellite center. Other communities had begun requesting their own versions of the program. "We've had to modify the design to fit different locations," he explained, "but the core concept remains the same, creating spaces where families can learn together." Victor Sterling entered the room, followed by a group of international educators who had come to study their model. The former rivals now worked seamlessly together, their combined experience creating something neither could have achieved alone. "Tell them about your latest idea, Tommy," Sterling encouraged, gesturing to their visitors. Tommy stood, pulling up a presentation on the main screen. "We're calling it the Growth Partnership Program," he explained. "The concept is simple. Pair experienced families who've completed our program with new participants. It's like companion planting in the garden, different groups supporting each other's growth." Harrison watched proudly as his grandson detailed the initiative. The teenage boy who had once lost millions in online games was now teaching others about the true value of mentorship and community support. Later that afternoon, Harrison found himself in what had once been his private study. now a bustling classroom where Tommy was leading a workshop for parents and teens. The session focused on understanding the psychology of online spending, turning his past mistakes into valuable lessons for others. "The tricks that got me into trouble haven't gone away," Tommy was explaining. "They've just gotten more sophisticated. But once you understand how they work, you can make better choices." Mrs. Chen, who had become the center's community outreach coordinator, entered quietly, signaling Harrison. "You need to see this," she whispered, leading him to the main hall, where a wall of photographs documented their journey. New pictures were being added, images of families working together in the gardens, students presenting their financial projects, community events that brought people from all walks of life together. But what caught Harrison's eye was a particular photo of Tommy, taken just after they'd lost everything, contrasted with a recent image of him teaching. The transformation was striking. The defeated, guilty expression had been replaced by confident purpose. His grandson had not only recovered from his mistakes, but had turned them into a force for positive change. "He's become quite the leader," Mrs. Chen said softly, noting Harrison's emotional response to the photos. "You all have in your own ways. You've shown people that losing everything doesn't mean losing who you are. Sometimes it means discovering who you're meant to be." A commotion from the garden drew their attention. A group of students had harvested their first crop of vegetables, a practical lesson in planning and patience that paralleled their financial education. Tommy was there, helping them understand how their small success could grow into bigger achievements with proper care and attention. "You know what's remarkable?" Victor Sterling said, joining them at the window. "A year ago, I thought owning this estate was my greatest triumph. Now I realize that giving it a new purpose, helping it grow into this..." He gestured at the bustling activity around them. "This is what real success looks like." The first anniversary of the Education Center approached with a sense of accomplishment that went far beyond anything the Montgomerys had achieved in their wealthy days. The estate, once a symbol of private success, had bloomed into a beacon of community growth and transformation. Harrison stood in the garden early one morning, watching the sunrise paint the sky in colors that reminded him of Elizabeth's favorite, roses. The garden paths were lined with plaques sharing financial wisdom through botanical metaphors, Tommy's innovative way of making complex concepts accessible to everyone. "Morning, Grandpa," Tommy called out, joining him with 2 cups of coffee, a simple gesture that had become their daily ritual. At 15, his grandson had grown not just in height, but in wisdom, carrying himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had found his true calling. "I've been thinking," Tommy said, handing Harrison a cup. "Remember when I used to measure success by how many rare items I could buy in those online games? Now, I measure it by how many families learned to avoid the traps I fell into." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of early morning visitors, a common sight now that the center had become a vital part of the community. A group of teenagers headed to the technology lab for a peer mentoring session, while parents gathered in the former dining room for a workshop on college planning. Michael appeared, excitement evident in his stance. "The results from our first year are in," he announced, tablet in hand. "Over 5,000 families directly impacted, and that's not counting the online program reach." Emma Sterling arrived next, her camera crew capturing moments for their educational channel. "Wait until you see today's lineup," she said enthusiastically. "We're streaming live workshops to schools in 5 different countries." The center had evolved beyond their initial vision, becoming a model for similar initiatives around the world. What started as a response to personal failure had grown into a movement that was changing how families approached financial education. Sarah joined them, her development team having created versions of their program in multiple languages. "The adaptive learning algorithms are showing amazing results," she reported. "The more families use the program, the better it becomes at addressing specific needs and challenges." Victor Sterling arrived for their morning meeting, but today he wasn't alone. With him was a representative from the National Education Board. "They want to make our program the standard for financial literacy education nationwide," Sterling announced, his pride evident not in the corporate way of old, but in the satisfaction of meaningful impact. As they gathered in the conference room, once Harrison's private study, Tommy took his usual place at the head of the table. The walls around them displayed not stock market tickers or profit margins, but stories and photographs of families whose lives had been changed by their program. "Before we start," Tommy said, pulling up a presentation, "I want to share something." The screen filled with a message from a teenage girl in another state. "Your program didn't just teach me about money. It taught me that mistakes don't define us. They can inspire us to help others." Harrison watched his grandson address the room with natural authority, remembering the broken boy who had once blamed himself for their family's fall. That pain had transformed into purpose, that shame into strength. Mrs. Chen entered with refreshments, as she had done countless times before, but now she was more than just a kind neighbor. She was an essential part of their success, her understanding of community needs helping shape their programs. "You know what's truly remarkable?" she said, setting down her tray. "It's not just the number of people you've helped. It's how you've changed the conversation about money. Families aren't just learning about finances. They're learning to communicate, to support each other, to grow together." Later that day, as the center buzzed with activity, Harrison found himself back in the garden. Tommy was there, teaching a group of children about compound interest using the growth patterns of plants. His grandson's voice was confident, his explanations clear and relatable. "You see these seedlings," Tommy was saying, "like your savings. They need 3 things to grow: time, care, and patience. There are no shortcuts in the garden or in building financial security." Victor Sterling joined Harrison, watching the scene. "You know, Harrison," he said quietly, "we spent years competing over who could accumulate more wealth. But your grandson has taught us both what real value looks like." Harrison nodded, understanding completely. Their greatest loss had led to their most meaningful victory, not in rebuilding their fortune, but in creating something that truly mattered. The estate that had once represented their fall from grace had become a source of growth and hope for countless others. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the grounds, Harrison watched Tommy lead his last workshop of the day. His grandson's face glowed with purpose as he helped others understand the lessons that had cost their family so much to learn. "Success isn't about what you own," Tommy was saying to his attentive audience. "It's about what you grow, in yourself and in others." The international conference room of the Education Center buzzed with anticipation. Representatives from educational institutions worldwide had gathered to learn about what the media had dubbed the Montgomery Method, a revolutionary approach to financial literacy that had begun with one family's fall from grace and evolved into a global movement. Tommy stood at the podium, no longer the nervous teenager who had once hidden from his mistakes, but a confident young man whose story had inspired thousands. Behind him, screens displayed real-time connections to similar centers that had opened across the country, each built on the model they had pioneered. 2 years ago, Tommy began, his voice steady and clear, "I thought I had destroyed my family's legacy through my mistakes with online gaming. Today I realize that legacy isn't about preserving wealth, it's about creating value for others." Harrison watched from the back of the room, his heart swelling with pride. The conference wasn't just about their program's success, it was a celebration of transformation, both personal and institutional. Educators, financial experts, and families had come together to share stories of how their approach had changed lives. Michael sat beside him, reviewing the latest implementation reports on his tablet. Their program had been adopted by school systems in 12 countries, with more joining every month. But it wasn't just the numbers that mattered, it was the fundamental shift in how families approached financial education. "Look at this," Michael whispered, showing Harrison a message from a parent in Singapore. "Their daughter used our program to create a financial literacy club at her school. They're using the garden metaphor to teach compound interest to elementary students." Emma Sterling, who had become an integral part of their team, was filming the conference for their educational channel. Her father, Victor, sat in the front row, his expression reflecting how far they'd all come from the days of corporate rivalry. The Sterling Industries logo now appeared alongside the Montgomery name on their materials, but as partners in education rather than competitors in business. Mrs. Chen moved through the crowd, coordinating with her international counterparts, who had traveled from various community centers around the world. What had started as her neighborly support had evolved into a global network of community facilitators, each adapting their methods to local needs while maintaining the core principles of their approach. The garden program has been particularly successful in rural areas, one coordinator from India reported. Families connect naturally with the idea of financial growth through agricultural metaphors. Sarah's development team had set up interactive displays showing how their software had evolved. The original program, born from Tommy's experience with gaming addiction, had grown into a comprehensive platform that addressed everything from basic budgeting to complex financial decisions. But unlike the games that had once trapped Tommy, their software empowered users to make informed choices. The key difference, Tommy explained to the audience, is that we never trick people into engagement. We show them real value, help them understand real consequences, and support real growth. During the break, Harrison found himself in the garden with Victor Sterling. The roses were in full bloom, their fragrance a reminder of Elizabeth and the legacy she had truly wanted for her family. "You know," Sterling said thoughtfully, "when I bought this estate, I thought I was claiming the ultimate victory. Now I realize I was just holding on to old ideas of success that don't really matter." Harrison nodded, understanding completely. "We both were. It took losing everything to understand what real wealth looks like." Inside, the conference continued, with presentations from families whose lives had been changed by their program. A teenage girl described how she had avoided the same gaming traps that had caught Tommy. A father shared how their family communication tools had helped him better understand his children's financial needs and fears. Tommy returned to the podium for the afternoon session, but this time he wasn't alone. He was joined by a panel of young people who had become peer educators in their own communities. Each had a story of how the program had changed their relationship with money and, more importantly, with their families. "What we're building here," Tommy said, gesturing to his fellow panelists, "isn't just about financial education. It's about creating a community where mistakes become stepping stones, where families grow stronger together, and where success is measured by the lives we touch." As the day drew to a close, Harrison found himself back in what had once been his private study. The room that had once displayed his business achievements now showed a different kind of success. Walls covered with letters, photos, and stories from families around the world who had found their way to financial wisdom through their program. Mrs. Chen joined him, carrying her signature end-of-day tea. "You know what's remarkable," she said, handing him a cup. "When you lived here before, this house was a symbol of what your family had. Now it's a symbol of what your family gives." As the international conference drew to a close, the education center hummed with renewed purpose. The gathering had not only celebrated their achievements, but had also sparked new initiatives that would extend their impact even further. Tommy spent the evening in the garden, his favorite thinking spot, processing the day's events with his father and grandfather. "You know what's amazing?" he said, looking up at the stars visible through the garden's canopy. "When we lost everything, I thought we'd lost our place in the world. Now I realize we just had to find a different kind of place." Michael nodded, understanding his son's reflection. The past 2 years had transformed them all, but Tommy's growth had been the most remarkable. The guilt-ridden boy who had once hidden from his gaming addiction had become a beacon of hope for others struggling with similar challenges. "The new satellite centers are asking for your training program," Michael mentioned, showing Tommy the latest requests on his tablet. "They want to understand how you connect with young people so effectively." Harrison listened to their discussion, remembering the days when success meant quarterly profits and market share. Now, success was measured in stories of transformation, families healing their relationships with money and each other, young people learning to make wise choices, communities growing stronger together. Emma approached with her camera crew, capturing final thoughts from conference participants. "The international feedback has been incredible," she reported excitedly. "Schools in Europe are particularly interested in our peer mentoring approach." Sarah joined them, her development team having spent the day sharing their latest innovations. "We've customized the software for different cultural contexts while maintaining the core principles," she explained. The garden metaphor seems to resonate across all cultures. Everyone understands the connection between nurturing growth and building sustainable futures. Victor Sterling appeared, walking the garden paths that had once symbolized his triumph over the Montgomerys, but now represented something far more meaningful. The board has approved funding for 10 more international centers, he announced, but more importantly, they've endorsed our approach of prioritizing impact over profit. Mrs. Chen emerged from the center's kitchen, where she had been coordinating with community leaders from around the world. The simple neighbor who had once brought them casseroles had become a crucial link between their global initiative and local implementation. Every culture has its own wisdom about money, she observed, setting down a tray of refreshments. Our program works because it respects these differences while sharing universal truths. As evening settled over the estate, families who had traveled from around the world to attend the conference lingered in the gardens, sharing stories and building connections. The property that had once been a symbol of private wealth had become a gathering place for a global community united by a common purpose. Tommy led an impromptu session with a group of teenage participants, showing them the latest features of their program. The most important thing we've learned, he told them, is that financial education isn't just about teaching facts and figures. It's about understanding ourselves and our relationships with money. Harrison watched his grandson with pride, noting how naturally he had grown into his role as a teacher and mentor. The mistakes that had once threatened to define Tommy had instead become the foundation for his greatest contributions. "You know what I love most about this place now?" Tommy said later, as they walked through the moonlit garden. "It's not just about what we teach. It's about what we learn from every person who comes here." Michael smiled, wrapping an arm around his son's shoulders. "And what have you learned, Tommy?" "That sometimes losing everything isn't an ending, it's a beginning. That mistakes don't have to define us, they can refine us. And that true wealth isn't about what we have, but about what we share." As they reached Elizabeth's Rose Garden, now the heart of their educational programs, Harrison felt a deep sense of peace. The fortune they had lost seemed insignificant compared to the legacy they had built. Not a legacy of wealth, but of wisdom. Not of possession, but of purpose. Mrs. Chen joined them one last time, carrying evening tea. "You know," she said, thoughtfully, "when you first moved into our neighborhood, we all felt sorry for you. Now our whole community is proud to be part of your story." Tommy looked around at the estate that had once been their home, then their loss, and now their gift to the world. "We're not done yet," he said with quiet determination. "There are still so many families we can help, so many lessons we can share." The evening stars twinkled above them, witnesses to a transformation that had turned personal loss into public good, private wealth into shared wisdom, and a family's darkest moment into a light that now guided others toward a brighter future. The Education Center had become more than just a place of learning. It was a living testament to the power of transformation. On this particular morning, Harrison walked through the halls early, before the daily bustle began, reflecting on how their journey had come full circle. The former ballroom, which had once hosted lavish parties for the city's elite, was being prepared for a different kind of gathering, the first Global Youth Financial Leadership Summit, organized entirely by Tommy and his international network of young mentors. "Grandpa," Tommy's voice echoed through the hall. He was already at work, coordinating with teen leaders from different countries via video conference. "You won't believe what the team in Japan developed. They've created a whole new module based on their cultural approach to saving," Harrison watched as his grandson expertly navigated between different time zones and cultures, bringing together young voices that might never have been heard in traditional financial education. The boy who had once lost millions in games had become a bridge between generations and cultures. Michael entered carrying blueprints for their newest initiative, mobile learning centers that would bring their program to rural communities. "The first prototype is ready," he announced, spreading the plans across a table. "Solar-powered with satellite internet connectivity, we can reach places that never had access to financial education before." Emma Sterling arrived with her latest production team, but they weren't just filming anymore. They were training young content creators from around the world to tell their own financial literacy stories. The authentic voices make all the difference, she explained, showing them footage from their global network. Sarah's development team had taken over the former library, turning it into a hub of technological innovation. But unlike the gaming companies that had once exploited young users, their technology was designed with a different purpose: to empower and educate. The new AI tutor adapts to each family's unique circumstances, Sarah demonstrated to a group of visiting educators. It recognizes cultural nuances, financial situations, and family dynamics to provide personalized guidance. Victor Sterling joined them later that morning, but not as the corporate titan he had once been. He had become a passionate advocate for ethical financial education, using his influence to challenge exploitative practices in the gaming and tech industries. The regulatory board is finally taking action, he reported, sharing the latest news. They're implementing standards based on our research about manipulative gaming mechanics. Tommy's testimony made a real impact. Mrs. Chen supervised the preparation of the summit's welcome area, where pictures and stories from their global community covered the walls. "Look at this," she said, pointing to a collection of letters. "Families from every continent, sharing how they've grown together through our program." As the young leaders began arriving for the summit, Harrison noticed something remarkable. These teenagers from different countries and backgrounds carried themselves with a confidence that came not from wealth or status, but from purpose and understanding. Tommy gathered them in the garden, where the metaphor of financial growth through natural cycles had first taken root. "Our strength," he told them, "comes from our mistakes and what we choose to grow from them. Each of you has a story that can help others avoid the pitfalls and find a better path." One young leader from Brazil shared how she had adapted the garden program for her favela community, teaching financial literacy through urban farming. Another from Kenya described combining traditional saving circles with digital tools from their platform. As Harrison observed these exchanges, he realized that their family story had become a seed that was sprouting in unique ways across the globe. The shame of their financial fall had transformed into a source of wisdom that transcended cultural and economic boundaries. Michael joined him, watching Tommy lead a workshop on ethical game design. "Remember when we thought losing the mansion was the end of our story?" he asked quietly. "Look at what it actually began." Harrison nodded, understanding deeply. Their greatest loss had led to countless gains, not in monetary terms, but in the richness of purpose and the depth of impact they now had on others' lives. Later that afternoon, during a break in the summit activities, Tommy found a quiet moment with his grandfather in Elizabeth's rose garden. "You know what's amazing," he reflected, tending to a new rose bush. "We thought we lost everything, but we actually found something priceless, a way to help others avoid the pain we went through." The garden, now a living classroom, had become a symbol of their journey. From the ashes of loss, new growth had emerged, stronger and more meaningful than before. The Youth Financial Leadership Summit reached its final day with an energy that filled every corner of the education center. Young leaders from around the world had spent the week sharing their experiences, developing new initiatives, and forging connections that would strengthen their global network of financial literacy advocates. In the garden, where it all began, Tommy gathered the summit participants for a closing ceremony that reflected how far they had all come. Each young leader planted a seed in a special section of the garden, creating a living memorial to their commitment to growth and change. "When I first started this journey," Tommy addressed the group, his voice carrying the wisdom of hard-earned experience, "I thought I was just trying to fix my mistakes. But what we've created together is something much bigger, a movement that helps others avoid the pitfalls and find their own path to success." Harrison watched from the garden path, remembering the day they had lost this estate. The pain of that moment now felt distant, replaced by the profound satisfaction of seeing how their loss had transformed into a gift for others. Michael stood beside his father, reviewing messages from their global network on his tablet. "Schools in 30 countries now use our program," he said quietly, "but the numbers don't tell the real story. It's the individual families, the lives changed, the relationships healed, That's our true success. Emma approached with her final documentary footage, capturing the moment as young leaders shared their visions for the future. "We're not just teaching about money anymore," she observed. "We're changing how generations talk to each other, how families support each other, how communities grow together." Sarah's team had set up interactive displays throughout the garden, showing how their program had evolved through collaboration with their global community. "Every culture adds something unique," she explained to visitors. "We're learning as much from them as they are from us." Victor Sterling, who had arrived for the closing ceremony, stood with Harrison watching Tommy lead the proceedings. "No," he said thoughtfully. "I spent years competing with you over who could accumulate more wealth. Now I realize we were measuring success by the wrong standards entirely." Mrs. Chen, who had become the heart of their community outreach, moved through the crowd distributing seed packets, a symbolic gesture representing how each participant would take these lessons back to their own communities to grow and share. "When you first moved into our neighborhood," she said to Harrison, "I brought you a casserole because I thought you needed food. Now you're feeding souls around the world." As the sun began to set on the final day, the garden glowed with warmth that seemed to come as much from the gathered community as from the dying light. Young leaders from different countries shared their plans for implementing what they had learned, each adding their own cultural wisdom to the growing tapestry of their program. Tommy stood in Elizabeth's rose garden, now the centerpiece of their educational approach, surrounded by the next generation of financial literacy advocates he had helped inspire. "Our greatest strength," he told them, "isn't in what we teach, but in how we learn from each other. Every mistake can become a lesson, every setback an opportunity for growth." Harrison watched his grandson with pride, seeing in him the perfect blend of past and future, the wisdom gained from their family's fall combined with the hope and innovation of youth. The boy who had once hidden from his mistakes now stood tall, helping others find their way through similar challenges. Michael joined them, wrapping an arm around his son's shoulders. "You've created something extraordinary here, Tommy. Something that will continue growing long after we're gone." As the ceremony concluded, participants gathered for a final moment of reflection in the garden. The estate that had once been a symbol of private wealth had become a beacon of shared wisdom, a place where mistakes were transformed into opportunities and losses into gains of a different kind. "You know what I've learned?" Tommy said to his father and grandfather as they watched the young leaders depart. "True wealth isn't what we have in our accounts, it's what we plant in others' hearts. And that kind of wealth, it only grows when we give it away." Harrison looked around at the estate that had once represented everything he thought mattered: status, success, financial security. Now it stood for something far more valuable: the power of transformation, the strength of community, and the endless possibilities that grow from embracing change rather than fearing it. The morning after the summit's conclusion brought a different kind of quiet to the education center. The international delegates had departed, carrying seeds of knowledge back to their communities, but the impact of their gathering still resonated through the halls of what had once been the Montgomery mansion. Harrison found Tommy in Elizabeth's rose garden, already at work despite the early hour. His grandson knelt in the soil, carefully tending to the new plants that the summit participants had added to their global garden. Each variety represented a different country's contribution to their growing movement. "I've been thinking, Grandpa," Tommy said, looking up as Harrison approached. "Remember that day when we got the call about the bank accounts being empty? I thought my life was over. Now I realize it was just beginning." Michael joined them, carrying 3 cups of coffee, a simple ritual that had become precious in their new life. "The first satellite centers are reporting amazing results," he shared, handing out the cups. "The mobile unit in rural areas has already reached families who never had access to financial education before." Sarah arrived with her tablet, showing them real-time data from their global network. "Look at this," she pointed excitedly. "The peer mentoring programs are spreading organically. Kids who completed our program are starting their own initiatives in their communities." Emma appeared with Victor Sterling, both reviewing footage from the summit. "The documentary is almost ready," she announced. "We're calling it Growing Wisdom." showing how a family's greatest loss became a gift to the world. Mrs. Chen emerged from the center's kitchen, where she had been training community outreach coordinators from different countries. "Your story gives people hope," she said, setting down a basket of fresh muffins. "It shows them that ending one chapter doesn't mean the book is over." As they gathered in what had once been Harrison's private study, now a warm and welcoming space for family financial counseling, the contrast between their past and present felt particularly poignant. The walls that had once displayed symbols of wealth now showcased stories of transformation from around the world. "You know what's remarkable?" Victor observed, looking at a photo of Tommy teaching young children about financial responsibility. "We thought success was about accumulating wealth. Your family has shown us it's about cultivating wisdom." Tommy stood by the window, looking out over the grounds where dozens of community programs now flourished. "When we lost everything," he reflected, "we actually found something more valuable, a way to help others avoid the pain we went through." Harrison watched his grandson, remembering the guilty, broken teenager who had blamed himself for their family's fall. That boy had grown into a young man who had transformed his greatest mistake into a mission that touched lives across the globe. Michael approached his son, placing a proud hand on his shoulder. "You've built something extraordinary here, Tommy. Something that will outlast any fortune we could have passed down." As the day progressed, families began arriving for their regular workshops, a mix of local community members and visitors from afar, all drawn by the authentic wisdom that grew from real experience. The mansion that had once been a symbol of exclusivity now opened its doors to anyone seeking to learn. "It's amazing," Mrs. Chen observed, watching the diverse group of participants interact. "You lost a house, but built a home for so many people's hopes and dreams." Later that afternoon, as the sun cast long shadows through Elizabeth's rose garden, Harrison found himself reflecting on their journey. The panic of that first phone call about their empty accounts seemed like a lifetime ago. What had felt like an ending had actually been a beginning, not just for their family, but for countless others who would learn from their experience. As autumn painted the education center's grounds in brilliant colors, the Montgomery family gathered for a special celebration, the launching of their 100th satellite center. The estate buzzed with activity as representatives from their global network joined local community members in marking this milestone. Tommy stood at the podium in the garden, surrounded by the flowers and wisdom that had grown from their family's darkest moment. The teenager who had once lost millions through online gaming had become a beacon of hope for young people around the world. "3 years ago," he began, his voice clear and confident, "I thought I had destroyed my family's legacy. Today I understand that legacy isn't about preserving wealth, it's about sharing wisdom. Every mistake can become a lesson, every setback an opportunity for growth." Michael sat beside Harrison, both watching with pride as Tommy addressed the gathered crowd. The father who had once hidden from neighbors in shame now stood tall, knowing their family's story had become a source of inspiration rather than scandal. Emma Sterling operated her camera with practiced ease, documenting this moment for their educational channel. Her father, Victor, sat among the audience, no longer the corporate rival, but a partner in their mission to transform financial education. "The numbers tell an incredible story," Sarah reported during her presentation. "Over 1 million families reached, thousands of young mentors trained, and a network that spans 6 continents. But the real impact can't be measured in statistics. It's in the lives changed, the relationships healed, the futures brightened." Mrs. Chen, who had become the heart of their community outreach program, moved through the crowd with her trademark warmth. "When the Montgomerys first lost their fortune," she shared with visitors, "our neighborhood tried to help them. Now they're helping the world." As the celebration continued, Harrison found himself back in Elizabeth's rose garden. The flowers his late wife had loved now bloomed alongside plants from around the world, each representing a community touched by their program. He thought about how proud she would be to see what their family had built from the ashes of their loss. "You know what's beautiful about this garden, Grandpa?" Tommy said, joining him among the roses. "Every plant has its own story, its own way of growing. Just like every family that comes here has their own journey to financial wisdom. Victor Sterling approached them, his corporate demeanor long softened by years of witnessing genuine impact. "I spent decades chasing wealth," he reflected. "Your family has shown us all what real value looks like." Michael joined them, carrying architectural plans for their next phase of expansion. But these weren't plans for profit. They were designs for hope, for growth, for transformation. The education center had become more than a building. It was a symbol of how loss could lead to unprecedented gains. "Remember when we thought losing the mansion was the end?" Michael asked softly. "Look at what it actually began." As the sun set on their celebration, casting a golden glow over the grounds, Harrison gathered with his son and grandson in what had once been his private study. The room that had witnessed their darkest moment now held their brightest achievements, not in certificates of wealth, but in letters from lives changed, photos of families healed, and stories of wisdom shared. "You know what I've learned?" Tommy said, looking at the wall of testimonials from around the world. "True wealth isn't something you can lose in a bank account. It's what you grow in others' hearts." The Education Center would continue its work, spreading financial wisdom and healing across the globe. But more than that, it would stand as a testament to the power of transformation. How one family's greatest loss became a gift to the world, how mistakes could bloom into wisdom, and how the end of one dream could lead to the beginning of something far more meaningful. As night fell and the celebration wound down, 3 generations of Montgomery men stood in their garden, surrounded by the fruits of their most valuable legacy, not the fortune they had lost, but the wisdom they had gained and shared with the world. "We didn't just rebuild our lives," Harrison reflected, looking at his son and grandson. "We built something bigger than ourselves, something that will keep growing long after we're gone." The estate that had once symbolized their fall from grace now stood as a beacon of hope, a testament to the truth that sometimes losing everything is just the beginning of finding something far more precious. Winter had given way to spring, and with it came a special milestone at the Education Center. The morning sun cast long shadows across the garden where Tommy stood, surrounded by a new generation of student mentors. They were preparing for their most ambitious project yet, a worldwide virtual summit that would connect young financial literacy advocates from every corner of the globe. "Each of you has a story," Tommy addressed the group, his confidence tempered by the humility that had become his trademark. "And each of those stories has the power to help someone else avoid the mistakes we've learned from." Harrison watched from the terrace, marveling at how naturally his grandson had grown into his role as a leader. The guilty teenager who had once hidden from his mistakes was now a beacon of hope for others, his past struggles transformed into stepping stones for countless young people. Michael appeared with Sarah and their development team, carrying exciting news. "The adaptive learning system has evolved beyond our expectations," Sarah announced, displaying the latest data. "It's not just teaching financial literacy anymore, it's helping families rebuild trust and communication." Emma arrived with her production crew, now a global network of young content creators who shared financial wisdom through their own cultural lenses. "The stories keep getting more powerful," she said, showing them footage from their international partners. "Each community adds its own perspective, its own wisdom." Mrs. Chen, who had expanded her role to coordinate community programs worldwide, emerged from the center with a group of international program directors. "Look at this," she said proudly, gesturing to a wall of photographs. "Every picture represents a family that found their way back to financial health through our program." Victor Sterling joined them later that morning, but not for a business meeting. He had come to mentor a group of young entrepreneurs who were developing ethical alternatives to predatory gaming practices. "Your grandson," he told Harrison, "has changed more than just how we teach financial literacy. He's changing how businesses think about their responsibility to young users." As the day progressed, the center filled with its usual busy energy. Families arrived for workshops, students gathered for peer mentoring sessions, and online connections brought distant communities together in shared learning. The mansion that had once symbolized private wealth now pulsed with the richness of shared wisdom. Tommy took a break from his sessions to walk with his father and grandfather, through Elizabeth's rose garden. The flowers were in full bloom, much like the programs that had grown from their family's experience. "You know what amazes me most?" Tommy reflected, stopping to tend to a new rosebush. "When we lost everything, we thought we'd lost our chance to make a difference in the world, but that loss became our greatest opportunity to help others." Michael nodded, understanding his son's words deeply. "We had to lose our fortune to find our purpose," he added, watching a group of students practice their peer mentoring techniques nearby. Harrison observed them both, his heart full of a different kind of pride than he'd known in his wealthy days. Their family had found something more valuable than any amount of money could buy, the ability to transform their own pain into purpose, their mistakes into wisdom. As evening approached, they gathered in what had once been Harrison's study for their daily reflection. The room that had witnessed their financial fall now held evidence of their true success, not in bank statements or investment portfolios, but in letters, photos, and stories from lives transformed. "I used to think legacy was about passing down wealth," Harrison said, looking at his son and grandson. "Now I understand it's about passing down wisdom, and not just keeping it in the family, but sharing it with anyone who needs it." The sunset painted the garden in golden hues as Tommy prepared for an evening workshop with international students. His voice carried clearly through the open windows, sharing not just financial knowledge, but the deeper lessons their family had learned about what truly matters in life. "Every ending can be a beginning," he told his students, words that echoed their own journey. "Every mistake can become a lesson. Every loss can lead to unexpected gains." The education center had become more than just a place of learning. It was a testament to the power of transformation, a living proof that sometimes losing everything is just the first step toward finding something far more valuable. The virtual global summit was drawing to a close, connecting thousands of young financial literacy advocates across time zones and cultures. Tommy stood in the center's main hall, now a state-of-the-art broadcasting hub, where screens showed faces from around the world, each one representing a community touched by their program. 3 years ago, Tommy addressed his global audience, "I thought I had made the biggest mistake of my life. Today I understand that mistakes are not endings, they're beginnings. They're opportunities to learn, to grow, and to help others, to avoid the same pitfalls." Harrison watched his grandson with quiet pride, remembering the day their world had seemingly collapsed with that devastating phone call. The pain of their financial loss had transformed into something precious, gift they could share with others, a wisdom that money couldn't buy. Michael stood beside his father, monitoring the global engagement metrics on his tablet. "It's extraordinary," he whispered. "Families from every continent, connecting and learning together. Who would have thought our darkest moment would lead to this?" Emma coordinated the international broadcast teams, ensuring that every voice had a chance to be heard. Her father, Victor Sterling, sat among the online participants, no longer the corporate rival, but a passionate advocate for ethical, financial education. "The next phase is even more exciting," Sarah announced during her presentation. "Our adaptive learning system now incorporates cultural wisdom from every community it serves. It's not just teaching, it's learning and growing with each family it helps." Mrs. Chen moved through the hall, coordinating with community leaders from around the world. "When the Montgomerys first lost their fortune," she shared with a group of new program directors, "they found something more valuable, a way to help others avoid the same pain." As the summit reached its final moments, Tommy invited participants to share their stories. One by one, voices from across the globe spoke of transformation, families healing, communities growing stronger, young people finding their way to financial wisdom through the path the Montgomerys had helped chart. Later in Elizabeth's rose garden, 3 generations of Montgomery men gathered for their evening ritual. The garden had become more than just a memorial to their past. It was a living symbol of how wisdom, like flowers, could bloom from the most unexpected circumstances. "You know what I've realized," Tommy said, tending to the roses his grandmother had loved. "We didn't just lose a fortune. We found a purpose, and that's worth more than all the money we ever had." Michael nodded, understanding deeply. "Our old wealth could only serve our family, but this He gestured to the center, alive with purpose even as evening fell. "This serves everyone who needs it." Harrison looked at his son and grandson, seeing in them a strength that no amount of money could have built. Their family had been broken by loss but rebuilt by purpose, shattered by mistakes but strengthened by wisdom. As night settled over the education center, the global summit concluded with a moment of shared reflection. Families from different cultures and backgrounds, all connected by a common journey toward financial wisdom, shared their hopes for the future. "This isn't the end," Tommy told their worldwide audience. "It's just another beginning. Every day brings new opportunities to learn, to grow, to share what we've learned with others." The Education Center would continue its work, spreading financial literacy and hope across the globe. But more than that, it would stand as a testament to the truth that sometimes the greatest gifts come disguised as losses, that the end of one dream can be the beginning of something far more meaningful. As the last participants signed off and the screens dimmed, Harrison stood with his family in the garden, where their journey of transformation had begun. The estate that had once symbolized their wealth now represented something far more valuable. The power of turning personal pain into public purpose, private loss into shared wisdom. "We didn't just rebuild our lives," Harrison reflected, looking at his son and grandson. "We built something that will keep growing long after we're gone, and that's the greatest fortune we could ever have." The stars began to appear above them, witnessing a family that had lost everything material but gained something priceless, the ability to help others find their way through the same darkness they had faced, toward a light they had discovered together. The Education Center glowed with warmth on a special evening as families gathered for the annual Legacy of Learning celebration. The event had grown from a small community gathering into an international celebration, connecting their global network of centers in a shared moment of reflection and purpose. Tommy stood in Elizabeth's rose garden, now a flourishing symbol of growth and transformation, preparing to address the gathered crowd both in person and through virtual connections worldwide. At 16, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had found his true calling. "When people ask me about our family's greatest achievement," he began, his voice clear in the evening air, "they expect to hear about the number of centers we've opened or the millions of families we've helped. But our real achievement isn't in the numbers. It's in the moments of transformation we get to witness every day." Harrison watched from nearby, his heart full as he observed how far they had come from that devastating phone call that had changed their lives. The mansion that had once been a symbol of their wealth now resonated with a different kind of richness, the wealth of wisdom, purpose, and shared growth. Michael joined them, bringing news that would once have seemed impossible. The World Education Council has officially adopted our program as their standard for financial literacy, he announced quietly. They're calling it the Montgomery Method, a holistic approach to teaching families about more than just money. Emma worked with her global team of young content creators, capturing stories of transformation from around the world. Her father, Victor Sterling, stood among the crowd not as a business titan, but as someone who had learned that true success couldn't be measured in dollars and cents. "Your family changed how we think about wealth," he told Harrison. "You showed us that the most valuable things can't be kept in a bank vault." Sarah's development team had set up interactive displays showcasing the evolution of their program. "Look at this," she demonstrated to visitors. "Every community that adopts our program adds their own wisdom, their own cultural understanding. It's grown far beyond what we initially imagined." Mrs. Chen, who had become the cornerstone of their global community outreach, moved through the gathering with her characteristic warmth. "When the Montgomerys first lost their fortune," she shared with new participants, "they found something more precious, a way to help others avoid the same pain and find their own path to wisdom." As evening settled over the center, families from different backgrounds, cultures, and economic situations shared their stories. A teenage girl described how the program had helped her family avoid foreclosure. A father spoke about rebuilding trust with his children through honest financial discussions. A grandmother shared how she was teaching her grandchildren values that would last longer than any inheritance. Tommy listened to each story with genuine interest, understanding that every testimony represented a family that had found their way to financial wisdom through the path his own family's loss had helped create. "So you know what's remarkable," he said to his father and grandfather later as they walked through the garden. "We're not just teaching people about money anymore. We're helping them understand what really matters in life." Michael nodded, looking at the center that hummed with purpose and possibility. "We lost a fortune," he reflected, "but we found a calling, and that's worth more than all the money we ever had." Harrison observed his son and grandson, seeing in them a strength and wisdom that no amount of wealth could have purchased. Their family had been broken by loss, but rebuilt by purpose, shattered by mistakes, but strengthened by the wisdom they had gained. As the celebration continued into the night, connecting time zones and cultures in a shared moment of hope, Harrison thought about Elizabeth and how proud she would be of the garden her family had grown, not just the roses that bloomed in her memory, but the flourishing of wisdom and purpose that had sprung from their greatest loss. The estate that had once been a symbol of private wealth now stood as a beacon of shared wisdom, a testament to the truth that sometimes the end of one dream can be the beginning of something far more meaningful. As dawn broke over the education center on the morning after the celebration, Harrison walked through the quiet halls, reflecting on the journey that had brought them here. The rooms that had once echoed with the hollow sounds of wealth now resonated with the rich harmony of purpose and shared wisdom. He found Tommy in Elizabeth's rose garden, already at work despite the early hour. His grandson knelt in the soil, planting new roses alongside the ones that had witnessed their family's transformation. Each bloom represented not just growth, but the endless possibility of beginning anew. "You know what I love most about gardening, Grandpa?" Tommy asked, looking up from his work. "It reminds us that every ending contains the seeds of a new beginning, just like our story." Michael joined them, carrying 3 cups of coffee, a simple ritual that had become precious in their new life. Together, they walked the grounds of what had once been their private estate, now a living testament to the power of transformation. "Remember that phone call?" Michael asked softly. "When we thought we'd lost everything?" Harrison nodded, the memory no longer painful, but profound. "We didn't lose everything," he replied. "We just had to learn to measure wealth differently." The morning sun painted the center in golden light as staff began arriving for another day of purpose. Sarah and her team prepared for a new series of global workshops, while Emma set up to broadcast success stories to their worldwide network of learners. Mrs. Chen arrived with her morning delivery of hope and wisdom, now shared not just through food, but through the programs she helped coordinate across continents. "Every day," she said, setting down her basket, "I see people arrive here broken by financial mistakes, and every day I see them leave with something more valuable than money. They leave with wisdom." Victor Sterling joined them for their morning meeting, no longer the corporate rival, but a partner in their mission to transform lives. "Your family," he told Harrison, "taught all of us that true wealth isn't about what you have, it's about what you give." As the center came alive with activity, Tommy gathered with his team of young mentors. They were no longer just teaching financial literacy. They were sharing a deeper understanding of value, purpose, and the real meaning of success. "Our story isn't about losing a fortune," Tommy told them. "It's about finding something more precious, a way to help others avoid the pain we went through and find their own path to wisdom." Harrison watched his grandson lead the morning session, seeing in him the perfect blend of past and future, the wisdom gained from their family's fall combined with the hope and innovation of youth. The boy who had once hidden from his mistakes now stood tall, helping others find their way through similar challenges. Michael placed a hand on his father's shoulder, both of them witnessing the extraordinary legacy their loss had created. "We thought we were building a financial education center," he said, "but we've actually built a place where people learn what truly matters in life." As the day progressed, families arrived seeking guidance, hope, and understanding. Each person who walked through their doors carried a story of struggle, but each left with something more valuable than money could buy: the wisdom to make better choices and the strength to begin again. In the evening, the 3 generations of Montgomery men gathered once more in Elizabeth's rose garden. The flowers bloomed around them, testament to the truth that beauty and wisdom could grow from the most unexpected circumstances. "You know what I've learned?" Tommy said, looking at the center that had grown from their family's greatest loss. "The most valuable things in life can't be measured in dollars and cents. They're measured in the lives we touch, the wisdom we share, and the hope we give to others." Harrison looked at his son and grandson, seeing in them a richness that no bank account could ever match. Their family had lost a fortune, but found a purpose, lost their wealth, but gained wisdom, lost their status, but found significance. As the sun set on another day of transformation at the center, Harrison thought about the true meaning of legacy. It wasn't about passing down wealth or property. It was about passing down wisdom, purpose, and the understanding that every loss could become a gift if viewed through the lens of service to others. The education center would continue its work, spreading financial literacy and hope across the globe. But more than that, it would stand as a testament to the truth that sometimes the greatest fortunes come disguised as losses, that the end of one dream can be the beginning of something far more meaningful. "We didn't just rebuild our lives," Harrison said, looking at his family. "We built something that will keep growing long after we're gone, and that's the greatest fortune we could ever have."